In the town of Lorne, everyone knew the sound of the mill bell. It rang before sunrise, slow and round, calling bakers to their ovens and carters to their mules. Settle in and rest a while. Its bronze voice drifted over roof tiles, chimney smoke, and the sleepy river. Yet one spring morning, when the bell had finished its third soft note, another sound answered it from somewhere below the town. It was smaller than a bell, lighter than a chime, almost like a spoon touching the rim of a clay cup. No one paused over it for long. A baker thought it was a shutter latch. A mule driver thought it was a loose buckle. A woman, drawing water, thought it was only the bucket chain speaking to itself. There had always been old corners in Lorne that people stepped around without asking much about them. Behind the spice seller's lane, below the broken steps where moss grew in the seams, there was a sealed wooden door set into a wall of pale stone. Children had pressed their palms to it in summer. Dogs had sniffed beneath it after rain. The grown people called it the Old Store Passage, though no one stored anything there, and no one living could say where the passage led. Tallow had wondered about that door since he was small enough to stand beneath its iron latch without reaching it. He was 12 now, narrow-shouldered and quiet-footed, with dark hair that never lay flat and careful hands from helping his mother mend baskets by lamplight. On that particular morning, while the town was still blue with sleep, he carried a bundle of willow strips along the spice seller's lane and turned his head toward the faint, cup-like sound. The air held the coolness that comes just before dawn, when night has not quite left and morning has not quite entered. Dew rested on the awning ropes. The shutters of the nut seller's stall were closed, their paint flaking in soft green curls. Somewhere, far off, a rooster tried one uncertain call, and then gave up as if he, too, preferred the hush. Tallow slowed. His mother had sent him to the baker's with a shallow basket whose rim had snapped the evening before. The baker's wife needed it before first kneading, and Tallow had been glad to go. He liked the town before it opened its eyes. He liked the way every familiar thing seemed to belong to itself for a little while. The empty trough, the stacked crates, the folded cloth over the fig stall, the street stones damp and silver underfoot. He shifted the repaired basket under his arm and listened. There it was again. Ting. Not loud, not even clear enough to be called a proper sound. It was more like memory becoming metal for a moment. Tallow looked toward the old door. It stood just beyond a row of sleeping market stalls, half hidden by 2 leaning poles and a curtain of last year's dried bean vines. The door was wider than most, made of dark planks bound with bands of iron. In its center was a small carved shape, worn smooth by weather. Tallow had always thought it was a leaf, though his older sister Myra said it was a fish, and his mother once said, without looking up from her work, that old doors often wore whatever shapes people needed them to wear. This morning, something thin and pale lay along the bottom of it. At first, Tallow thought it was mist. Then he stepped closer and saw it was not mist, but a line of flour, or ash, or dust so white it seemed almost moonlit. It had sifted out beneath the door and gathered in a delicate crescent on the stones. Tallow crouched. The basket's willow strips creaked softly against his sleeve. He touched the pale dust with one finger. It was cool, finer than ground meal, and it smelled faintly of dried mint, clay, and old wood. He rubbed it between finger and thumb, then held it near his nose. Beneath the mint there was something else, something sweet and dry, like apricot stones kept in a drawer. Another sound came from behind the door, not a ting this time, but a sigh, the kind old hinges make when they dream of being opened. Talo stood so quickly that the basket knocked against his hip. Nothing happened. The town remained peaceful. Smoke began to lift from 3 chimneys. A cat crossed the lane with its tail high and stopped to glance at Talo as if he had disturbed a private thought. The spice seller's painted sign, shaped like a red pepper, swung once in the windless air and became still again. Talo? The voice was soft, but it made him turn. At the end of the lane stood Mistress Elu, wrapped in a brown wool shawl, though the season was not cold enough for one. She was 82, everyone said, though she herself never gave the same number twice. Sometimes she said she was older than the bridge. Sometimes she said she was young enough to remember where she had left her best needle, which was almost never true. She had been, long ago, keeper of the South Lanterns, the ones that marked the river road when merchants came through fog. Now she lived in the narrow house beside the dried herb shop and kept little pots of thyme on every windowsill. Talo straightened his shoulders. "Good morning, Mistress Elu." "Morning is not quite here," she said, walking toward him with a slow tap of her hazelwood cane. "But it has sent word ahead." Her cane had a silver cap dulled with age, and each tap made a small wooden sound against the stones. She stopped beside him and looked not at his face, but at the dust beneath the old door. Talo waited. Mistress Elu leaned down as far as her back allowed. She did not touch the pale powder. She only breathed in gently. Her eyes, which were pale brown and lined at the corners, softened with recognition. "Well," she murmured, "it has remembered us." Talo looked from her to the door. "What has?" "The Undermarket." He had never heard the word before, but it settled into the lane as if it had been waiting there all along. Undermarket. It made him think of roots beneath paving stones, of folded cloth tucked at the bottom of a chest, of coins found under sleeping mats after many years. "There is no market under here," he said, though he said it quietly, because the door did not seem to want loud words near it. Mistress Elu smiled, not with amusement, but with patience. "There was. Before your mother's mother was born, before the upper stalls took all the sunlight, before the river changed its bend, and the east road became the cart road." Talo looked down the lane. The bakers would be waiting, but not yet impatient. The first kneading never began until the 4th bell. He could still smell only the oldest warmth from their ovens, not the new bread. "What did they sell there?" he asked. "What people needed before day had properly begun," said Mistress Elu. "Salt in cloth packets, lamp oil, river reeds, needles, wool cord, dried pears, barley cakes wrapped in leaves, little clay cups for travelers who could not carry heavy things, thread dyed with onion skins and madder root, herbs gathered before sun touched them, and sometimes messages for those who left at dawn and those who arrived before it." She rested one hand against the old door. Her fingers were bent with age, but they lay carefully on the wood, as if greeting a sleeping animal. Talo looked at the iron latch, which was high and black and flecked with rust. Why did it close? Mistress Alu took a moment to answer. This was one of the things people knew about her. She never hurried a memory. She let it walk at its own pace until it reached her. Not all at once, she said. Few useful things disappear all at once. First, the east road sank in the rains, and carts began using the bridge road. Then, the lantern boys became bridge boys. Then the river traders stopped coming before dawn because the new toll gate opened later. Then the undermarket opened only on mist mornings, then only on spring mornings, then only when someone remembered the key. Who had the key? She lifted her eyes to the worn carving in the door. Several people. That was the trouble. When too many people are meant to remember a thing, each one thinks another will do it. The mill bell rang again in the distance. Its fourth note widened slowly through the town. Talo startled. I have to take this basket. Yes, said Mistress Alu. Bread waits kindly, but not forever. He stepped backward, still looking at the door. The pale dust lay where it had fallen, fine and quiet. Did you hear the sound? I did. What was it? Mistress Alu touched the small silver cap of her cane to the stones, just beside the dust, without disturbing it. A stall bell, perhaps, or a cup on a shelf, or the market turning in its sleep. Talo did not know what to say to that. It was exactly the sort of thing Mistress Alu would say, and yet this morning it sounded less like fancy and more like instruction. Come by after your errands, she added, if your mother can spare you for a little while. To do what? To see whether the old hinges remember my hands. He nodded, though the nod felt larger inside him than outside. Then he hurried along the lane, past the nut seller's stall, past the hanging scale covered in cloth, past the sleeping spice jars stacked behind shutters. The repaired basket was light under his arm, but his thoughts were full and slow. At the bakery, the door was already open. Warmth rolled out in a soft cloud smelling of yeast, ash, and wet flour. Mistress Pella, the baker's wife, stood with her sleeves tied above her elbows, her gray hair wrapped in a kerchief. She took the basket from Talo and ran her thumb along the mended rim. Good work, she said. Your mother's hands? Mine, mostly. Then good work twice. Talo looked toward the ovens where the fire had been banked low through the night and was being coaxed awake with dry twigs. The first loaves were not shaped yet. Dough rested beneath cloth like sleeping hills. Did you ever hear of the undermarket? He asked. Mistress Pella paused. Her floury hand hovered over the basket. The what? The undermarket, beneath the old door in Spice Lane. She leaned toward the window as if she might see it from there, though the bakery faced the wrong street. My grandmother used to say there was a place where the dawn traders came out of the ground with warm oil and blue thread. But she also said onions grew sweeter if you sang to them. So who can say? Talo smiled. Did you believe her? When I was small, yes. When I grew older, no. Now I am old enough to think perhaps small children and grandmothers are sometimes nearer the truth than those of us in the middle. She set the basket on a shelf and gave him a barley heel brushed with honey water, too small to sell but too good to waste. For your walk back. He thanked her and tucked the warm bread in his hand. Outside, Morning was arriving in pale layers. The sky over the rooftops had turned the color of watered milk. Shopkeepers lifted shutters. A man rolled 2 barrels toward the alehouse. Myra, Talo's sister, passed at the end of the street with a tray of folded cloth for the dyer, walking quickly, because she always walked as if she had promised time itself to be punctual. At home, his mother sat beside the open doorway, soaking Willow in a trough. Her name was Sen, and she worked with such calm concentration that even her smallest movements seemed measured by breath. Talo's little brother, Ivan, still round-faced with sleep, sat on a mat nearby threading wooden beads onto a cord and unthreading them again with great seriousness. "You were quick," his mother said. "Not very," said Talo. She looked up then. "Ah, something found you." His mother had a way of noticing without looking. "It came," she said, "from basket work. A basket told you where it was weak if you watched the spaces, not the reeds." Talo sat on the doorstep and told her about the sound, the white dust, the old door, and Mistress Elu. He told it plainly, because his mother preferred plain telling before wonder was added. Ivan listened with his mouth slightly open, holding 3 red beads in one hand. "The undermarket," Sen said when he had finished. "You know it?" "I know the word. My father used to say his aunt bought lamp wicks there on fog mornings. He said the wicks burned steadier than any from the upper stalls." "Was it real?" His mother drew a willow strip from the water and smoothed it between her fingers. "A useful place. Leaves marks even after people stop using it. A path pressed into grass. A hook worn thin by a rope. A name that stays in mouths. That does not prove everything, but it proves something. May I go to Mistress Elu after I finish the side handles?" Sen examined his face. She did not smile, though warmth came into her eyes. "You may go after the side handles, after sweeping the shavings, and after eating something more than whatever Mistress Pella put in your hand." Talo looked at the honeyed barley heel, already half eaten. His mother's mouth curved. "Yes, I know." The morning opened slowly around them. Sunlight slid across the threshold. Ivan dropped his beads and chased them, one by one, as they rolled over the floorboards. Talo sat beside the soaking trough and worked on 2 market baskets that needed their handles strengthened. He liked this part of mending best. A broken base could be stubborn, a split rim could pinch, but a handle had a way of telling the hand how it wanted to be shaped. He softened the willow, bent it, listened to its quiet complaint, then bent it again more gently. His mother worked beside him. Now and then, she reached over and turned a strip in his fingers, or showed him where the weave had loosened. She did not speak much. The house had its own small sounds, water dripping from willow tips, Ivan humming to himself, the scrape of a stool leg, the sigh of reeds drawn through the hand. Beyond the doorway came the market waking fully, with wheels, hooves, voices, and the faint clatter of copper pots being set out for the day. But under all of that, in Talo's mind, there remained the small sound. Ting! It had not been bright like a bell calling attention. It had been patient, as if it had been sounding for many years and had no need to be heard by everyone at once. By the time he swept the shavings into the kindling basket and ate a bowl of millet with stewed apples, the sun had risen above the roofs. The mysterious hush of early morning had thinned, but not vanished. It lingered in shaded alleys, beneath carts, inside jars, under awnings still damp with dew. Mistress Elu's house stood at the narrowest part of Herb Row, where bundles of sage, lavender, yarrow, and tansy hung from rafters and made the air smell clean and old. Her door was painted blue, though most of the paint had softened into gray. 3 clay lamps sat on the sill, each one mended at least once. A string of tiny brass bells hung beside the doorway, but they did not ring when Tallow knocked. They only trembled. "Come in," called Mistress Elu. Inside, her house was dim and tidy, in the manner of places kept by someone who remembered where things belonged even when she could not always reach them. Shelves lined the walls. On them were rolled cloth, labeled jars, river stones, folded maps, wooden boxes, bits of twine wound into neat circles, and lantern glass wrapped in linen. A kettle steamed near the hearth, breathing out the scent of mint. Mistress Elu sat at a small table with a square of oilcloth spread before her. On the oilcloth lay several objects: a ring of old keys, a small brush, a stub of beeswax, a twist of rag, a narrow bottle of lamp oil, and a folded leather pouch darkened by years. Tallow stood in the doorway until she gestured to the stool opposite her. "Hands clean?" she asked. He showed them. "Clean enough for old metal, not clean enough for bread, but we are not making bread." He sat. She pushed the ring of keys toward him. There were 7 keys, each a different size. Some were simple, some had teeth like tiny hills, and one was so thin it looked as if it might have been made for a doll's cupboard. The largest was black with age and shaped at the top like a leaf or perhaps a fish. Tallow touched it with one finger. "Is this the key?" It was one of them. What if it no longer works? Then we learn that. Learning what does not open a door is still learning. She handed him the rag. "Wipe gently. Do not polish away its age. Only remove what keeps it from doing its work." Tallow took the key carefully. It was heavier than it looked. The metal held a chill that slowly warmed against his skin. He rubbed the stem, and a brownish dust came away on the cloth. Beneath it the iron showed dark and smooth, worn by hands that had turned it long ago. He imagined those hands: a salt cellar with cracked knuckles, a lantern boy with oil under his nails, a woman carrying dyed thread in a chest, a sleepy child sent ahead to lift a latch. Mistress Elu watched him work. "Do you know why I asked you?" Tallow shook his head. "Because you stopped when you heard it. Anyone would have stopped." "No," she said, not unkindly. "Most people hear what fits inside the day they already expect. They do not hear the small thing asking them to make room." Tallow looked down at the key. He was not sure whether he felt proud or shy, so he only rubbed more carefully around the teeth. Mistress Elu opened the leather pouch and drew out a folded piece of stiff cloth. When she spread it on the table, Tallow saw lines drawn in brown ink, faded almost to the color of tea. It was a map, but not like the maps in the council room that showed fields and roads. This map showed passages, archways, steps, and little squares marked with symbols. She tapped one symbol with her smallest finger, the old door in Spice Lane. Talo leaned closer. A line ran from the door, curved under what must have been the hill below the market, and opened into a long oval space. Around the oval were smaller marks like stalls. Another passage led toward the river, another toward the lower granary. A third ended at a place marked with 3 circles. "What is there?" Talo asked. "The cistern court if it still stands. And here?" "The East Salt Steps. They used to lead to the road where pack mules came down from the dry hills." Talo traced without touching, following the lines with his eyes. "All this is under the town?" "Under part of it. Beside part of it. Old towns are layered like baskets. One weaving rests upon another. If the lower weaving breaks, sometimes the upper one forgets why it sags." He liked that. He understood it in his hands before he understood it in his mind. Mistress Alu rolled the map again and tied it with a cord. "We will not go far today." Talo looked up quickly. "Today, if the door permits." The word made the room seem quieter. Permits? As though the door had a say, as though old wood and iron remembered courtesy. Mistress Alu rose slowly. Talo stood at once, but she waved away his help until she had gathered her cane. Then she allowed him to carry the oil bottle, the brush, and the beeswax in a small cloth bag. Old hinges, she said, must be persuaded, not conquered. Outside, the day had become clear and mild. The market was busy now, though not crowded. Women compared onions. A potter arranged cups by size. 2 boys carried a rolled rug between them and moved with exaggerated care, as if it were a sleeping elder. From the fish stall came the clean, sharp smell of river catch laid over wet reeds. Above the spice seller's lane hung colored cloths to shade the jars of cumin, coriander, fennel, dried rose, pepper, and salt. As Talo walked beside Mistress Elu, people greeted her. She answered each greeting with a nod or a few words. No one asked where they were going, though several looked at the cloth bag in Talo's hand and then toward the old door. News in a town did not always travel by speech. Sometimes it passed by glances, by pauses, by the way a seller stopped tying a bundle when someone walked toward a place usually ignored. The old door looked different in daylight, less mysterious, perhaps, but more patient. The planks were scarred and gray at the edges. Tiny plants had rooted where the stone met the threshold. The iron latch had a reddish bloom of rust around its base. The pale dust still lay beneath, though a breeze had loosened its edges. Mistress Elu stood before it for a long moment. "Good morning," she said. Talo glanced at her, but she seemed entirely serious, so he gave a small nod to the door as well. She held out her hand, and he gave her the large key. Her fingers closed around it. She did not put it into the lock at once. First she brushed the keyhole with the small brush, removing grit from its rim. Then she dipped the rag in oil and touched it to the latch pin. The smell rose warm and dark, like seeds and iron and lamp smoke. "Watch," she said. Talo watched. She worked slowly. Oil, pause, wipe, oil again. A touch of beeswax along the key. Not too much. "Never too much," she said, "because excess only gathers dust and calls itself care." Talo held the bag open and passed each thing when she asked. Her hands trembled slightly, but they did not hurry. Once, when the brush slipped, Talo reached to catch it and knocked the oil bottle with his sleeve. It tipped, but did not fall. He froze. Mistress Elu steadied it with the end of her cane. "Small mistakes prefer small corrections," she said. Talo breathed out. "I'm sorry. Then your hands are awake. That is enough." When at last she set the key into the lock, the market sounds behind them seemed to draw back. A spice seller lowered his voice. The potter stopped stacking cups. Somewhere a mule bell shook its head once, and then was still. Mistress Elu turned the key. At first, nothing. Then came a deep, reluctant click from inside the wood. Talo felt it through the soles of his feet. Mistress Elu did not smile yet. She rested one hand on the latch and lifted. The latch rose halfway, stuck, and gave a low groan. Talo stepped forward without being told and pressed gently near the lower hinge, where she had oiled it. Together, with no more force than one might use to wake a drowsing child, they eased the latch higher. The door opened the width of a finger. Cool air slipped out. It smelled of clay, old straw, dry herbs, stone, and something faintly sweet, like fruit kept through winter in a loft. The pale dust stirred at the threshold. Talo saw darkness beyond, but not empty darkness. There was a shape to it, a waiting depth. A narrow line of light from the lane fell across stone just inside the door, and in that light lay a small brass bell no larger than a walnut. Its rim was cracked. Its handle was shaped like a leaf, or perhaps a fish. Mistress Elu looked down at it for a long while. "There you are," she whispered. Talo's voice came softly. Was that what rang? Perhaps. Who left it there? Someone who meant to come back for it, or someone who left it so the market would not forget its own voice. She did not cross the threshold. Neither did Talo. The open finger width of darkness seemed enough for one morning. The town continued behind them, but gently now, as if it too had lowered its pace to listen. Mistress Elu bent with care, and Talo offered his arm without making a fuss of it. She accepted. Together they picked up the little bell. It was dusty, but not ruined. When Talo held it, the cracked rim touched his palm with a coolness that made him think of dawn water. He did not ring it. He knew, without being told, that some sounds should wait until they were ready. The old woman closed the door again, not locking it fully this time. The latch settled with a softer note than before. "Today," she said, "we have opened the idea of it." Talo looked at the door, then at the market lane, where people had begun moving again. Will others help? If we ask properly. Not everyone at once. Brooms first, lamps after, then ropes, cloth, and patience. He liked the order of that. Brooms first, lamps after. It made the undermarket seem less like a secret and more like a task that could be held in the hands. Mistress Elu wrapped the cracked bell in the rag and placed it in the cloth bag. "Take me home, Talo. My knees have spent their morning coins." He walked beside her through the lane. The sun had warmed the awnings, releasing the smell of dyed cloth and old rain. A jar of fennel seeds had been opened nearby, and its sweetness drifted after them. Behind the stalls, the door waited with its hinges newly oiled, its lock no longer silent, and a thin crescent of pale dust at its feet. At Mistress Alu's house, she poured mint tea into 2 small clay cups. Talo sat at her table while the wrapped bell rested between them. Neither spoke for a while. Through the open window came the gentle sounds of Lorne in daylight, bargaining, sweeping, laughter, cartwheels, the flap of cloth, the little calls of sellers arranging their goods. At last Talo said, "Why do you think it sounded today?" Mistress Alu held her cup in both hands. Steam softened the lines of her face. "Perhaps because the hinges were tired of being still," she said. "Perhaps because spring has a way of asking old things whether they still have roots. Or perhaps because someone who walks before dawn finally listened." Talo looked at his hands. There was dark oil near one thumbnail and pale dust in the crease of his palm. Usually, after mending baskets, his hands showed willow and water. Today they showed a door. "May I come tomorrow?" he asked. Mistress Alu's answer was almost too gentle to be called a yes, but it was one. When Talo returned home near noon, his mother was setting lentils over the hearth. Ivan slept on the mat with one bead still clutched in his fist. Mayera had come back from the dyer and was folding cloth with quick, neat movements. "Well?" his mother asked. Talo sat beside the doorway, where sunlight lay warm on the floorboards. "It opened a little," he said. Mayera raised her eyebrows. "A little is more than shut." His mother nodded as if this were a sensible measurement. Talo told them about the key, the oil, the map, the crack in the brass bell, and the cool smell from behind the door. He told them how Mistress Elu said brooms must come before lamps. As he spoke, his mother placed a bowl of lentils in his hands, and the bowl was warm, and the lentils smelled of onion and bay leaf. He ate slowly. The story seemed to settle better that way. That evening, after the market closed and the town folded itself into lamplight, Talo helped his mother sort old broomcorn from new. Mayera found a length of faded awning cloth in the storage chest, still strong along one edge. Ivan, awake again and full of importance, offered 3 wooden beads for the undermarket, though no one yet knew what use beads might have there. Outside, the mill bell rang the hour of rest. This time, no smaller sound answered it. There was only the ordinary hush after sunset, the creak of cooling roofs, the river moving in its bed, and the low murmur of families behind shutters. But Talo did not feel disappointed. Some things, he was beginning to learn, did not need to call twice once they had been heard. Before sleep, he washed his hands. The oil came away. The dust did not entirely. A pale trace remained near the base of his thumb, fine as flour, faint as moonlight. He lay on his mat and listened to his house breathing around him, his mother banking the hearth, Mayera turning once beneath her blanket, Ivan sighing in his sleep. In his mind he saw the old door, the careful key, the finger width of darkness, and the little cracked bell wrapped in cloth on Mistress Alu's table. The undermarket had not opened, not truly, but something kinder and quieter had begun, and in the soft dark before dreaming, Talo felt that the town of Lorne, layered like a basket and patient as old wood, had made room for one small sound at dawn. The following morning, the streets of Lorne lay in gentle hush. Dew clung to every stone, every awning rope, and the river whispered low beneath the bridge, carrying a subtle, steady pulse that seemed older than the town itself. Talo awoke with a lightness in his chest, a quiet anticipation that was neither anxious nor hurried. He dressed with care, brushing his dark hair so it would lie flatter than usual, and tucked the bundle containing the cracked brass bell carefully beneath his arm. His little brother Ivan remained curled in a mat near the hearth, still deep in sleep, and Myra had already left, her footsteps fading in the distance, carrying her errands with the kind of determined speed Talo sometimes envied. Outside, the first light painted the cobblestones in muted silver, and the scent of wet straw and faint ash from the mills settled over the town. Each step Talo took on the uneven stones felt measured, a slow rhythm that he allowed himself to follow, as though the town itself breathed beneath his feet. Mistress Alu waited on the narrow doorstep of her house, her shawl drawn snug around her shoulders, her cane leaning patiently against the doorframe. She greeted Talo with the smallest of nods, enough to say she was ready and patient, but without hurry. "The door remembers us again," she murmured, and in her tone the words held no excitement, only the gentle acknowledgement that this morning had a purpose that had been waiting. Together they approached the old store passage, and Talo felt the familiar tug of curiosity as he drew near the narrow opening. Mistress Alu guided him with her hand, not pressing, only steadying, and for the first time he noticed the small carvings on the planks that had previously escaped his attention: tiny leaves, twisted vines, the faint outline of a fish, all worn nearly smooth by time and touch. The narrow darkness seemed to breathe beneath the door, patient and quiet. Inside, the undermarket unfolded like a dream. The air was cooler here, still carrying a hint of clay and herbs, mingled with the faint tang of river water that had seeped through the cracks. Each corridor seemed alive with memory. The stones bore impressions of countless feet, worn smooth by generations. The walls whispered faintly of trades long past, and the faint smell of old candles hung lightly in the shadows. Talo's hand brushed against a stone ledge, feeling the smooth grooves pressed by years of careful use. Mistress Alu moved beside him, guiding his hands over surfaces with a delicate touch, teaching him to observe without disturbing. Their first stop was the cistern court, a rounded chamber that had once housed many of the undermarket's earliest stalls. Low shelves lined the walls, mostly empty, though small treasures remained. A clay cup with a subtle crack, a bundle of faded herbs, and a spool of linen thread, its color faded to dusk. Talo lifted each object carefully, rolling it between his palms and breathing in the faint scent of onion skins and dried matter. Mistress Alu instructed him gently. "Notice what survives. Notice what rests. You are learning to listen, not to take." Talo's fingers lingered on the spool of thread. He imagined the hand that had dyed it, fingers stained with natural pigments, movements deliberate, patient and careful. Somewhere deeper in the undermarket, a faint metallic tinkle, softer than any bell, stirred the air. Talo did not reach for it, only acknowledged its presence, feeling a shiver of connection to those who had walked these passages before him. They moved deeper, through narrow corridors and low arches, where the air grew damper and cooler, and the scent of river water was more pronounced. The east salt steps, worn by centuries of passage, greeted them next. Talo ran his palms along the curved edges of each stone, feeling the history pressed into their surfaces. Mistress Alu's eyes traced the same lines, reading the silent stories of trades, conversations, and footsteps, as one might read lines of text on a page. At last, they entered the wide oval hall, its ceiling partially collapsed, allowing shafts of morning light to spill across the floor. Dust motes drifted lazily, catching the light in fleeting glimmers. The ground was scattered with remnants, shards of pottery, twisted hooks of iron, frayed lengths of cloth. Talo knelt and began to sort, brushing the dust gently from each piece, arranging them in patterns he imagined once resembled stalls and counters. Mistress Elu observed, occasionally guiding his hand, showing him where the curve of a hook or the fold of fabric might indicate its original place. Their work continued for hours, slow and deliberate. Talo learned to handle the objects with care, to sense the rhythm of the undermarket. He brushed clay cups with the softest touch, lifted cloths folded long ago, and placed iron hooks upright on small pedestals. Each action was a small act of restoration, a meditation in motion. He realized that care itself could be a form of respect, a language older than words. Mistress Alu spoke only when necessary. Even the smallest sound can remind a place of its own voice, she whispered, as Talo gently lifted the cracked brass bell from its resting spot and shook it slightly. Its tone was faint but persistent, resonating like the echo of memory, a sound that seemed to belong both to the past and to this moment. After a simple meal of bread and dried apricots, shared in quiet companionship, they resumed their work. Talo found himself noticing things he had overlooked the day before. A faint footprint pressed into a corner stone, the way a shelf had sagged slightly where heavy objects had once rested, the faint curvature of the walls suggesting how the space had been used long ago. Each discovery was small, almost imperceptible, yet it brought him a gentle satisfaction, a deepening understanding of patience and observation. Mistress Alu guided him through a side passage that led toward what had once been the lower granary. Here, the smell of stored grain lingered faintly, mixed with the earthy scent of stone. Talo touched the wooden bins carefully, noting where the wood had warped and where the iron hinges had rusted. He learned to coax the hinges open, oiling and adjusting them with a delicate touch. Each minor correction was an opportunity to practice attention, patience, and gentle problem solving. Hours passed with soft dialogue, small adjustments, and mindful observation. Talo felt the rhythm of the undermarket settle into him, a slow and steady cadence that mirrored the town above, yet moved at its own pace. The walls, the floors, the objects, and the faint traces of those who had once passed through all seemed to participate, acknowledging the care being given. By late afternoon, the light had shifted, softening into golden warmth. The oval hall glowed with the scattered sunlight, dust motes catching the light like tiny stars. The little brass bell, carefully cleaned and wrapped, seemed to radiate its own quiet presence. Talo lifted it once more, letting it rest gently in his palm. Its cracked rim pressed coolly against his skin, and he imagined it singing softly to the passage, calling it awake without demanding attention. They began the slow walk back toward the entrance, retracing steps through corridors and passages now familiar and comforting. Talo noticed the changes, the way the light had shifted, the warmth of the stones under his palms, the soft echo of their movements, Mistress Alu guided him to the threshold, and together they paused before the door, the world above waiting silently. "Will it remember tomorrow?" Tallow asked, a question that had formed quietly during their work. "It will remember," Mistress Alu said, "if we continue to listen, and if others come with care. A place such as this cannot be forced. It must be invited. Patience and attention are the keys." Outside, the market lanes were alive with the afternoon bustle. People moved slowly, the warmth of the sun on their backs, unaware of the quiet revival occurring beneath the town. Tallow carried his basket home with a sense of responsibility and awe, each step deliberate, each breath filled with the scent of sun-warmed stone and herbs. He noticed details he had ignored before, the rhythmic clatter of cartwheels, the faint scent of spices, the gentle tilt of an awning catching the wind just so. At home, his mother was tending the hearth, arranging lentils in a neat circle. Ivan played quietly with wooden beads, still catching glimpses of the undermarket in his mind. Myra returned with folded cloth, her movements precise and purposeful. Tallow set down the basket and recounted the day, describing the passage, the oval hall, the careful placement of objects, the sound of the little bell, and the patient rhythm of Mistress Elu's guidance. "You have been learning more than mending," his mother said, her voice calm and measured. "You have been learning to notice. That is worth more than many tasks combined." That evening, Tallow washed his hands. The faint traces of oil and dust lingered, a reminder of the day's careful work. He lay on his mat, listening to the quiet hum of the household, his mother's rhythmic weaving, Myra's whispered movements, Ivan's soft sighs and sleep. Outside, the town settled into dusk, the river murmuring gently, shutters closing with soft thuds, and the faint scent of herbs and bread hanging in the air. In his mind, Tallow replayed the undermarket, the smooth stones, the narrow passages, the scattered remnants, and the little brass bell. He understood that the place had not only survived, but had responded to care, patience, and attention. The old door in Spice Lane, the hinges, the shadows, and the faint echoes of past traders and children were part of a living rhythm, one that required quiet observation to be fully understood. Dreams carried him gently, filled with images of narrow passages lined with low shelves, arches that glimmered with sunlight, and the faint, patient note of the bell. The undermarket hummed softly, a hidden world restored not fully, but enough to remind Tallow, and perhaps the town itself, that forgotten places can remember when someone listens with care. When morning came, he would rise again, carry his basket, and meet Mistress Alu at the threshold. He would oil hinges, lift objects, and observe patiently, knowing that every small act mattered. And even as the town above moved with its familiar rhythm of commerce and chatter, Tallow would carry the quiet lesson below, that time, care, and gentle attention can awaken what has been long forgotten. The town of Lorne rested that night like a basket of layers, patient as old wood, while one small sound at dawn had reminded it that memory, even faint, could be coaxed back into life, and Tallow, small, careful, and attentive, had become a part of that rhythm, holding a place in the quiet, layered heartbeat of the undermarket. In the dim glow of evening, the little brass bell lay wrapped in its cloth, waiting patiently. Somewhere deep in the passage, dust shifted slightly, stones settled gently, and the faint scent of herbs and clay filled the air. The undermarket was not fully open, not fully alive, but it had begun to breathe again, quietly, slowly, and deliberately. And for Tallow, this knowledge was enough to close his eyes with peace, his mind filled with small, patient sounds and the soft rhythm of a hidden, remembered place. The day ended quietly. The town's ordinary noises softened into evening hums. Tallow slept, Ivan curled beside him, Myera's gentle rustle in the next room, the hearth breathing warmth. Outside, the river flowed steadily beneath the bridge. The mill bell rested until morning, and the undermarket waited, patient, layered, and ready to speak again to those who would listen. Our second story begins as we step into the early mist of Grieve, a town nestled along a narrow river bend, where the morning fog lingers like a silver veil over rooftops and cobblestone streets. Lanterns swing gently from wooden posts, still unlit, and the smell of damp straw and river water fills the quiet air. The river moves slowly, carrying reeds and fallen petals downstream, and somewhere a wooden cart creaks softly against the cobbles. A single bell tinkles faintly, not loud enough to wake the town, but enough to draw the attention of those who are awake early. Settle in and rest a while. It is not a bell for calling, nor for warning, but for remembering, a small sound in a large, hushed world. In a corner by the wharf, an old wooden crate is stacked beneath a shuttered window. One edge of the crate is frayed, its nails rusted, and a thin line of powder, pale as river silt, has gathered along the seam. No one notices it at first. A boatman passes without seeing. A baker's apprentice hurries along the bank, and a cat tiptoes over the cobbles, pausing only to sniff the morning air. Only a child notices. Sira, 12 years old, crouches near the crate, her hands resting on her knees. Her hair, dark with a tint of copper, falls over her forehead, damp from the fog. She wears a simple wool tunic, patched at the elbows, and carries a small bundle of reed brushes she gathered from her mother's shop. Her eyes are wide, but calm, and she tilts her head slightly toward the pale line of powder. There is a gap here, Sira thinks, between what everyone passes by and what waits to be found. The gap has a weight that is quiet but insistent, like a thought that rises slowly at the edge of a dream. She reaches a careful hand toward the line, her fingers hovering just above it, sensing the texture, the coolness of the dust, the whisper of stories it might hold. Sira's grandmother, Merrick, often spoke of listening before seeing. Things speak first in silence, she said, and only when you lean close will they tell you their small truths. Sira remembers this as she examines the powder. It is finer than flour, softer than ground clay, almost like mist that has settled into stone. She follows its path with a finger, tracing its curve along the crate and toward a narrow gap in the dock's boards. The town is quiet enough that the soft creak of a shutter seems almost loud. A boat sways gently against the rope tied to a post, the line humming faintly as it stretches. Somewhere farther along the river, a bellbird calls, and the sound drifts in through the mist. faint and solitary. Sira stands slowly, brushing her hands together. She glances at the river, at the gray shapes of houses, and then at the narrow passage under the crate. She senses a threshold, a place between the ordinary morning and something waiting quietly beneath the town. Her fingers graze the boards, hesitant, almost reverent, as though touching a memory long forgotten. A soft voice interrupts her thoughts. "You have found it, haven't you?" Sira turns to see Merrick, her grandmother, standing on the dock. She is 80 years old, but her posture is straight, her eyes sharp and knowing. Her hands rest lightly on a walking stick made of oiled oak, polished smooth by decades of use. She wears a long brown coat over a wool dress, the hems frayed but carefully mended. Her gray hair is braided and coiled at the back of her head, and a small leather pouch hangs from her belt. "Found what?" Sira asks, though she already knows the answer. "The quiet places," Marek says, "the ones that speak only to those who notice. Not all hear them, and fewer still pause." Sira glances back at the crate. The pale powder traces a line that disappears into a small gap beneath the boards. "It's waiting," she says softly. "Exactly," Merrick replies. She steps closer, her cane tapping lightly against the dock. "Some things must be approached with care. You cannot rush them. They require patience, observation, and a gentle hand." Sira kneels again, studying the narrow gap. She imagines what might lie beneath, a hidden store of goods, long forgotten tools, scraps of cloth and thread, the faint aroma of herbs preserved by time. She can almost hear the faint whisper of movement, the subtle hint of a bell or a small chime that has lingered in the quiet spaces for decades. Merrick sits beside her, leaning slightly on her cane. "Do you know why some places wait?" she asks. "Because the world above moves quickly. People hurry. They do not see the small things that matter. The undertown, the forgotten dock, the narrow alleys. They remember, and they will answer only to those who come with care." Sira nods slowly. She senses a rhythm here, a slow and deliberate cadence that is separate from the town above. Every plank, every beam, every shadow seems to hold a memory, waiting to be understood. Merrick reaches into her leather pouch and withdraws a small brush and a bottle of oil. "We will need these," she says, passing them to Sira. "The boards have settled. They have dust and rust and small detritus that must be moved gently. Not all work is loud. Not all progress is immediate." Sira takes the brush carefully, feeling its bristles against her fingers. She dips it in oil, the scent sharp but comforting, and begins to sweep the dust along the edges of the gap, revealing worn nails and small carved marks in the wood. Each stroke is deliberate, unhurried, a conversation between her hands and the boards beneath them. The river mist curls around the dock, and the faint morning sun begins to warm the town. Sira notices details she would have overlooked before: the faint shimmer of water on the boards, the way a single reed sways in the current, the subtle scent of smoked fish carried from a nearby stall. Her attention stretches to every small movement, every quiet sound, and the undertown seems to respond, as if acknowledging her care. "See?" Merrick murmurs. "It speaks when you listen." Sira leans closer to the gap, brushing gently along the wood, revealing the worn grain beneath decades of neglect. She imagines the traders who once passed here before dawn, carrying herbs, linen, small tools, and messages between boats and warehouses. Each item left its mark on the boards, and now her hands trace those marks as though touching history itself. A soft bell tinkles faintly from somewhere below the dock. Sira pauses, listening intently. The sound is delicate, almost imperceptible, like a whisper carried on water. She lifts the brush again, careful not to disturb the resonance, following the sound as it weaves beneath the boards. Merrick watches her silently, a gentle smile on her lined face. "Patience," she says. "The world below is slow. You must learn its pace before you can move within it." Sira continues, brushing and sweeping, lifting small objects she finds, a fragment of clay, a worn rope, a piece of thread dyed with onion skins. Each item is examined carefully, placed aside, never hurried, never discarded. The undertown seems alive with memory, responding to her attentiveness. Hours pass. The mist lifts slowly from the river, sunlight glinting off water and cobblestones. The town above resumes its ordinary rhythm. Boats move along the river, merchants open their stalls, the baker arranges loaves on shelves. But below the dock, in the narrow gap in the forgotten boards, time feels different. It flows more deliberately, measured by the brush strokes and the soft chime of the bell. Sira pauses to rest, sitting cross-legged on the dock. Merrick pours them both a small cup of warm tea from a flask she has brought, the aroma of mint and dried herbs mingling with the river air. They sip quietly, listening to the faint sounds beneath the boards. The tea warms Sira's hands and her chest, and she feels a connection not only to the space, but to the generations who moved through it long before her. "Tomorrow," Merrick says softly, "we will go further. There are passages that have not been touched for decades, walls that remember the touch of hands long gone. But today, you have learned the first lesson: to move slowly, to notice, to listen." Sira nods, feeling the weight and responsibility of what she has discovered. The undertown is more than a hidden place. It is a rhythm, a memory, a quiet world that waits for those willing to meet it on its own terms. The morning stretches on, golden light spilling across the dock, river reeds shimmering, and the town's ordinary life continuing above. Yet Sira's attention remains partly below, in the shadows and the pale dust, in the faint bell and the worn boards. She understands now that some places do not reveal themselves fully all at once. They must be coaxed gently, tended with care, and approached with patience. By midday, they have prepared the area under the crate as best they can for the day, leaving no trace of haste, only careful, deliberate restoration. The pale powder is brushed gently along the seams, the bell rests securely, and the narrow gap is clear, waiting for the next stage of exploration. Sira looks at Merrick, whose eyes are kind but serious. "Do you think anyone else will remember this place?" she asks. "Perhaps," Merrick replies. "But memory is not a thing to be shared recklessly. It grows slowly, with attention and respect. The undertown will speak to those who are ready to hear." Sira smiles faintly, feeling a quiet sense of accomplishment. She knows that she has taken the first steps into a hidden rhythm, a slow world beneath the town, and that the lessons she has learned will stay with her. The patience to notice, the care to preserve, and the understanding that some sounds and spaces demand quiet attention before they can reveal themselves fully. With the sun high above the river, they rise together. Sierra carries the small bundle of brushes and threads, Merrick leaning on her cane, and they walk slowly back toward the familiar streets. The market is alive now with voices and movement, but Sierra notices every small detail: the way sunlight glints on copper pots, the scent of spices mingling in the air, the rhythm of footsteps on cobbles. She walks carefully, aware that the world above and below are connected by attention, patience, and memory. At home, her family greets her quietly. The warmth of the hearth, the smell of bread, and the gentle murmur of conversation remind her that the ordinary world carries its own rhythms, equally important to observe. That evening, as the river glimmers in the fading light and lanterns begin to glow softly along the streets, Sierra lies in bed, thinking of the narrow gap beneath the dock, the pale powder, the little bell, and the worn boards. She feels the quiet satisfaction of discovery, the gentle pride of careful work, and the soft anticipation of returning tomorrow, when the undertown will continue to teach its patient, deliberate lessons. And so the morning mist has passed, the town of Grieve carries on above, and Sierra drifts into sleep with the rhythm of the hidden passages and soft, deliberate sounds echoing in her mind, a world of memory and care waiting patiently for those who listen. The next morning, the river's surface lay smooth as polished glass, reflecting the faint pink of dawn. Sierra woke before anyone else, the memory of yesterday's discovery still fresh in her mind. She dressed quickly, tying her dark hair into a simple braid that fell down her back, and carried her bundle of brushes and threads carefully. The town of Grieve had begun to stir, the faint sounds of carts rolling over cobblestones, a rooster calling somewhere near the northern wharf, and the distant murmur of water moving against the docks reached her ears like a soft song. Sierra approached the river dock with a deliberate calm, noting every detail of the morning as though it were a map. Mist clung to the stones, softening the edges of the warehouses and boats. Sunlight shimmered faintly on the wet boards, turning each droplet into a tiny golden flame. The air smelled of wet straw, river mud, and a faint sweetness of herbs that had been tucked in crates overnight. Every step she took was careful, her feet pressing lightly against the cobbles, feeling the rhythm of the town beneath her. Merrick was waiting at the narrow gap beneath the crate, leaning lightly on her polished oak cane. Her gray eyes, sharp and knowing despite the years, followed Sierra's every movement. The morning air carried a faint hum, the kind that seems to come when the world is paused between night and day, and Sierra felt the anticipation curl gently in her chest. "Are you ready?" Merrick asked, her voice low and steady. Sierra nodded, brushing her palms over the wet boards to remove lingering dew. "I think so," she said, though the words carried more reverence than certainty. Merrick smiled faintly, her lips curving with patience. "Good. Today we move further. The undertown will speak more clearly if you listen with care. Remember what you learned yesterday. Every object, every surface has its own story, and every sound has a place in the rhythm of this space." Together, they knelt beside the gap. Sierra held the small brushes, her fingers careful and light, dipping them in a mixture of oil and warm water that Merrick had prepared. The boards were cooler than yesterday, damp from the river's mist, and she felt the smoothness and roughness in turns, tracing the grain and lifting the smallest fragments of dust and debris. Each stroke revealed a hint of history, faint scratches from nails, worn patches where feet had pressed, remnants of ink that had long since faded. Sierra paused at a particularly worn corner. She traced the groove gently with her fingertip and imagined the hands that had pressed there before, traders carrying herbs and threads, children delivering messages, women balancing small baskets of salt and dried fruits. Each line seemed alive, a memory that responded to her attention. Merrick leaned closer, her eyes scanning the boards. "Good," she murmured. "You see not just the surface, but the echo beneath it. Each mark tells a story if you are patient enough to hear it." Sierra moved slowly, following a narrow passage that curved beneath the dock. The air grew cooler here, mingled with the faint scent of clay and river mud. Tiny shafts of light filtered through cracks above, illuminating specks of dust that danced like small stars in the soft glow. The boards creaked faintly beneath their weight, a quiet music that accompanied each careful step. They reached a wider chamber, previously hidden by crates and debris. The room was lined with low wooden shelves, now empty except for scattered remnants of cloth, clay fragments, and bundles of dried herbs. Sierra's eyes lingered on the details, the faint curl of cloth edges frayed by time, the smoothness of clay cups worn by decades of careful handling, the faint metallic glint of hooks and nails. Merrick gestured toward a low shelf. "Start there. Move gently, one object at a time. Listen to the surfaces, not just with your ears, but with your hands. They will tell you what to do." Sierra knelt, lifting a small clay cup and brushing it gently with the soft bristles. The cup smelled faintly of clay and river water, warmed by the sun that seeped through cracks above. She held it in her palm, turning it slowly, imagining the hand that had shaped it and the careful use it had seen. Each object she lifted became more than a piece of clay or cloth. It became a memory, a quiet story of life in the undertown. Hours passed in slow, deliberate rhythm. Sierra worked carefully, cleaning, arranging, and observing, guided by Merrick's quiet instructions. They restored hooks to their original positions, folded bundles of cloth with gentle precision, and organized the remnants of herbs according to their scents. The undertown responded to their care. Shadows shifted softly as sunlight moved across the boards. Dust motes swirled and settled, and the faint echo of movement seemed to carry approval for their attention. Midway through the morning, Sierra paused to rest. Marek handed her a small cup of tea, the scent of mint and dried herbs mingling with the river air. They sat in quiet companionship, listening to the faint creak of boards, the distant murmur of water, and the soft tinkle of the brass bell from yesterday, which seemed to hum faintly in the background. "The bell is patient," Marek said softly. "It does not demand attention. It waits for those who know how to listen." Sierra nodded, feeling the truth of her grandmother's words. She realized that the undertown was not simply a hidden space, but a rhythm, a slow-moving pulse that required patience, observation, and gentle care. Every object, every surface, every sound had a place, and every movement had a consequence. They resumed their work, moving deeper into the passage. Sierra discovered a small side chamber, filled with the faint scent of dried herbs and aged wood. She traced her fingers over the walls, noticing carved marks that had been worn smooth by countless hands. Small bundles of cloth lay forgotten in corners, and tiny clay fragments littered the floor. Each item she touched seemed to carry a quiet message, and she worked carefully to arrange them, lifting them gently and placing them with attention. Merrick watched her silently, occasionally guiding her hand or pointing out a detail that might otherwise be overlooked. Patience, she reminded her. The world below moves slowly. You must learn its pace before you can move fully within it. As afternoon approached, the sunlight shifted, casting long, golden beams through the cracks in the boards above. Dust motes glimmered in the light, and the faint hum of the river below seeped through the walls. Sira continued her work, brushing, lifting, and arranging, feeling a quiet satisfaction in the slow, deliberate rhythm. She paused at a particularly worn corner, tracing a deep groove in the wood. She imagined the hands that had pressed there before, traders carrying herbs and threads, children delivering messages, women balancing small baskets of salt and dried fruits. Each line seemed alive, a memory that responded to her attention. Marek leaned closer. "Good," she murmured. "You see not just the surface, but the echo beneath it. Each mark tells a story if you are patient enough to hear it." Sira smiled faintly, feeling a quiet pride in her understanding. She realized that the Undertown was not simply a hidden space, but a living rhythm, a world that moved slowly and required care to understand. By late afternoon, they had restored much of the chamber to a state that honored its past. The shelves were cleared, the hooks replaced, the cloth folded, and the clay fragments arranged with care. The brass bell from yesterday hummed faintly, as if acknowledging their efforts. Sira and Marek paused to rest, sipping tea and listening to the faint sounds of the Undertown. The passage seemed to settle around them, a quiet acknowledgement of their care. They had not uncovered every secret, nor fully restored every object, but they had begun a dialogue with the space, one of patience, attention, and gentle respect. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, they prepared to leave, retracing their steps through the narrow corridors. Sira noticed the changes, the way the light had shifted, the warmth of the boards under her palms, the soft echo of their movements. The Undertown seemed alive, responsive to their care, and she felt a deep sense of connection to the generations who had passed through these passages long before her. Emerging onto the dock, Sira breathed deeply. The mist now lifted, sunlight warming her face. The town above carried on its ordinary rhythm, but she noticed every detail: the shimmer of copper pots, the scent of spices, the rhythm of footsteps. She carried the lessons of the Undertown with her, a slow, deliberate awareness that would guide her every movement. At home, her family greeted her quietly. The warmth of the hearth, the smell of bread, and the gentle murmur of conversation reminded her that the ordinary world carried its own rhythms, equally important to observe. Sira felt a quiet satisfaction, knowing that the Undertown awaited her return, patient and deliberate, ready to share more of its secrets when approached with care. That night, as lanterns glimmered along the river and the town settled into quiet hums, Sira lay in bed, thinking of the narrow gap, the pale powder, and the worn boards. She felt the rhythm of the hidden passages, the gentle lesson of patience, and the quiet anticipation of returning the next day to continue her exploration. The following morning, a fine mist hung low over Grieve, curling along the river and weaving between the narrow wooden piers. The town was quiet, the usual chatter of the bakers and boatmen still muted beneath the soft gray light. Sierra rose with the first hint of dawn, her dark braids swinging lightly as she moved through the house. Ivan was still asleep, curled on his mat. Mayra had already left to deliver a bundle of cloth to the dyer, her soft footsteps fading down the cobbled street. Sierra gathered her brushes and the small bundle of threads, tucking the brass bell carefully into the cloth bag, and stepped outside. The river was calm, its surface glassy and undisturbed, except for the occasional ripple where a fish broke the stillness or a reed bent with the faint current. Mist clung to the wooden pilings, softening their edges and making them seem as though they had grown from the river itself. Sierra inhaled deeply, smelling the mixture of river water, wet wood, and the faint, lingering sweetness of herbs that had been left in crates overnight. The air was damp and cool, and each step she took on the planks of the dock was careful and deliberate. Marek awaited her at the threshold of the undertown, her oak cane tapping lightly against the boards in a gentle rhythm. Her gray eyes, sharp and knowing despite her years, followed Sierra's every movement. "You are early," she said softly. The undertown appreciates those who arrive before the sun fully wakes. It allows the place to recognize your presence, to measure your patience. Sierra nodded, kneeling beside the narrow gap beneath the crate. She brushed her palms over the wet boards, feeling the grain, the worn edges, and the faint traces of pale powder from previous visits. She dipped the brushes in the mixture Marek had prepared, warm water with a trace of oil, and began to sweep the boards gently, lifting dust, debris, and remnants of forgotten trades. Each stroke revealed a hint of history: scratches from nails, marks where baskets had been placed, small indentations made by hands long gone. Marek knelt beside her, her hands folded over her cane. "Listen," she murmured, "not with your ears, but with your hands, your eyes, your mind. Every mark has a story, and every story responds to those who approach carefully." Sierra moved slowly, tracing the grooves with her fingertips, imagining the merchants, children, and workers who had moved through these passages long before her. She lifted a fragment of clay, examining its smooth edges and faint curve, and set it aside on a clean patch of boards. She handled the small spool of faded thread with equal care, noting its softness and the subtle variations in color that suggested dye from onion skins and madder root. The air in the undertown seemed to deepen as they moved, cooler and heavier with the scent of stone, wood, and lingering herbs. Sunlight filtered through cracks above, illuminating dust motes that floated like tiny stars. Every movement, every careful touch, became part of the rhythm of the place. Sierra began to sense a flow, a deliberate pulse that seemed to synchronize with her own breathing. They moved deeper into the passage, following a narrow corridor that curved beneath the dock. The boards creaked faintly under their weight, a soft accompaniment to their quiet work. The faint sound of the brass bell from yesterday's discovery resonated somewhere in the shadows, a gentle reminder that the undertown was aware of their presence. At the end of the corridor, a low arch opened into a chamber that had remained untouched for decades. The walls were lined with shelves, most empty, though scattered remnants of cloth, clay, and wood remained. The floor was uneven, littered with small fragments of pottery and the occasional loose nail. Sierra knelt, brushing away layers of dust to reveal the worn surfaces beneath. Each object she uncovered told a story: a small clay cup that had held herbs or water, a frayed bundle of thread, a tiny hook that had once supported a hanging basket. Marek watched silently, occasionally offering guidance. "Every object has its own voice," she said softly. "Learn to hear it. Learn to respond with care, not force." Sierra lifted a clay cup, turning it slowly in her hands. The surface was cool and slightly rough, worn smooth in places by years of handling. She imagined the person who had used it, the careful way they had held it, the small sounds it might have made when set on a wooden shelf. She felt a connection to the past, a sense of continuity that made the undertown seem alive in a way that the ordinary town above could never be. Hours passed in a rhythm of careful work and quiet observation. Sierra brushed, lifted, and arranged, placing objects in patterns that honored their original use. She restored hooks to their upright positions, folded cloth with deliberate precision, and organized small fragments of clay and wood according to size and shape. The undertown responded subtly, shadows shifting slightly, dust motes dancing in the light, and the faint hum of the brass bell echoing through the passages. During a pause, Marek poured tea from a small flask. The aroma of mint and dried herbs mingled with the damp air, comforting and grounding. They sipped quietly, listening to the gentle creak of boards and the faint whisper of the river through the cracks in the dock. "Do you feel the rhythm?" Marek asked. "The pulse of the undertown? It moves slowly, deliberately, and responds to those who respect its pace." Sierra nodded, feeling the subtle cadence of the place in her own movements. She realized that the undertown was not merely a hidden space, but a living rhythm that required attention, patience, and gentle care. Every object, every surface, and every sound was part of a conversation that unfolded slowly and quietly. They continued their work, moving deeper into the chamber. Sierra discovered a small side room filled with faint traces of herbs and aged wood. She brushed her hands over the walls, noting faint carvings and indentations that had been worn smooth by time. Small bundles of cloth lay forgotten in corners, and tiny clay fragments littered the floor. Each item she touched seemed to speak softly to her, and she arranged them with care, lifting and placing them deliberately, mindful of the stories they carried. Marek occasionally offered guidance, pointing out subtle details. "See how the boards curve here? It tells you where weight rested, how the space was used. Follow the lines, and you will understand more than the eyes alone can see." The afternoon sunlight shifted through the cracks above, casting golden beams that illuminated dust motes and fragments of debris. Sierra continued her work, brushing, lifting, and arranging with deliberate care. The rhythm of her movements synchronized with the pulse of the undertown, each stroke of the brush and placement of an object contributing to a quiet harmony. She paused to examine a small wooden hook, worn smooth by years of use. The shape was delicate, the edges rounded, and it fit perfectly into a groove in the wall. Sira placed it carefully, feeling the satisfaction of a small restoration completed. The brass bell, resting nearby, tumbled faintly, its sound soft and patient, as if acknowledging her careful touch. Merrick observed, her expression calm and approving. "Every small act matters," she said. "Even a single placement, a single stroke, a single breath of attention. These are the moments that keep memory alive." Sira felt the weight and significance of her work. The Undertown was no longer merely a curiosity. It was a living space, alive with echoes of the past and responsive to careful attention. Each object, each surface, each subtle sound held meaning, and her awareness of them deepened with every passing hour. As the day progressed, they worked together to restore order to the chamber. Clay fragments were arranged, hooks returned to their positions, cloth bundles folded and stacked with care. The space, once forgotten and neglected, began to feel alive again, responding to their deliberate movements. The faint hum of the brass bell and the subtle creak of boards created a quiet music, accompanying their meticulous work. By late afternoon, the chamber was transformed. While not fully restored, it had regained a sense of order and rhythm. The shelves were cleared, hooks replaced, and cloth and clay carefully organized. The Undertown seemed to settle around them, a quiet acknowledgement of their efforts. Sira felt a deep sense of accomplishment, knowing that her careful attention had helped awaken a hidden space, bringing it back into the rhythm of life. Emerging from the passage, Sira breathed deeply, inhaling the mist-laden air of the river. The town above was awake now, the sounds of merchants, boats, and townspeople rising softly. Yet Sira noticed every detail: the shimmer of sunlight on wet boards, the scent of herbs drifting from stalls, the gentle sway of reeds in the current. She carried the lessons of the Undertown with her, a sense of patience, observation, and gentle care that extended beyond the hidden passages. At home, her family greeted her quietly. The warmth of the hearth, the smell of bread, and the soft murmur of conversation reminded her that the ordinary world had its own rhythms. Sira felt a quiet satisfaction, understanding that the lessons of the Undertown could be applied to everyday life. Careful attention, patience, and the awareness that even small acts of care have meaning. That night, as lanterns began to glow softly along the river, and the town settled into evening calm, Sira lay in bed, thinking of the passages, the pale powder, and the worn boards. She felt the rhythm of the hidden world beneath the dock, the gentle lessons of patience and observation, and the anticipation of returning the next day to continue exploring. The Undertown had begun to speak to her, softly and slowly, revealing secrets only to those willing to listen and act with care. Sira understood now that memory, attention, and deliberate action could awaken spaces long forgotten, and that even the smallest gestures could bring a hidden world back to life. And so, as the river flowed quietly beneath the docks, as lanterns glimmered and the town breathed in soft evening hums, Sira drifted into sleep, the pulse of the Undertown echoing gently in her mind, a rhythm of patience, care, and quiet restoration that would guide her in the days to come. The morning arrived in a silver haze, the kind of light that softened every edge and made even the familiar streets of Grieve feel new. Sira woke before dawn, the quiet rhythm of the town still holding its breath. She dressed quickly, tying her braid low to avoid snagging on her tunic, and gathered her small bundle of brushes, the brass bell, and the scraps of thread she had carried yesterday. The air was damp and cool, carrying the scent of the river mixed with the faint sweetness of herbs from nearby stalls. Each step toward the dock was deliberate, her bare eyes scanning every detail of the stones and wooden planks, every shadow and flicker of mist. Marek waited as always at the threshold of the undertown, her silhouette calm against the soft light. The oak cane in her hand tapped lightly on the boards, marking a rhythm that Sira had come to recognize as both gentle and precise. "Today," Marek said, her voice low, "we go deeper than before. The passages you have seen are only the beginning. The heart of the undertown has waited for those willing to approach slowly and with care." Sira nodded, feeling the quiet anticipation settle in her chest. She knelt beside the narrow gap beneath the crate, brushing her hands across the boards, lifting the pale dust and debris that had settled overnight. She dipped the brushes in oil and warm water, moving slowly, deliberately, as if the slightest haste might disturb something unseen. The undertown welcomed them with its familiar coolness, the scent of clay, herbs, and river water deepening as they moved further in. The soft creak of boards and the faint hum of the brass bell from previous days formed a quiet accompaniment to their work. Sira felt the pulse of the hidden passages under her fingers, and in the soles of her feet, a slow rhythm that seemed almost alive, responding to her careful attention. They entered the first chamber, a long, narrow room lined with shelves and low tables. Most of the surfaces were empty, though remnants of cloth, clay fragments, and small tools remained. Sira knelt to examine the objects, brushing away dust and placing them carefully on a clean patch of floor. Each item felt alive under her fingertips. The cool, smooth surface of clay cups, the frayed edges of fabric, the faint scent of herbs preserved in tight bundles. She arranged the remnants with deliberate care, noticing the subtle curves and lines of the shelves and tables, imagining how they had once been used. Marek observed, her expression calm and approving. "Every mark, every object carries a story," she said. "Some are obvious, others faint, but all respond to those who notice." Sira moved slowly, tracing the worn grooves in the boards where feet had pressed countless times. She felt the echo of past footsteps, the rhythm of traders, children, and workers long gone. Each trace guided her hands, teaching her the rhythm of the space, the quiet order of the undertown. She lifted small clay fragments, arranging them by size, and brushed dust from hooks and nails that had long been overlooked. The chamber seemed to breathe around her, shadows shifting subtly as sunlight filtered through cracks above, illuminating motes of dust that danced like tiny stars. Hours passed in quiet rhythm. Sira and Marek worked methodically, restoring order to the chamber, lifting objects with care, and arranging them in patterns that honored their original purpose. The brass bell, resting nearby, responded faintly, its soft resonance a reminder that the undertown was aware of their presence and appreciated their careful attention. At midday, Merrick poured a small cup of tea from her flask, the scent of mint and dried herbs blending with the cool, damp air of the passages. They sat in quiet companionship, sipping and listening to the subtle creaks and shifts of the boards. The bell's faint hum echoed softly through the chamber, a gentle reminder of yesterday's lessons and the quiet patience required to explore the deeper passages. "Do you feel the heart of the place?" Merrick asked. "It is deeper, slower, and requires more care. You must move with it, not against it." Sierra nodded, feeling the subtle rhythm of the undertown in her movements and breath. She understood now that the passages were not merely physical spaces, but living rhythms. Each object, surface, and sound a note in a quiet symphony that had persisted for decades. They continued deeper into the undertown, following a corridor that narrowed and twisted beneath the dock. The air grew cooler, heavier with the scent of stone and river water. Tiny shafts of light illuminated the dust-laden air, highlighting fragments of clay, thread, and wood. Each step required careful attention, each brushstroke deliberate, and Sierra moved with a growing awareness of the space, her senses attuned to its subtle signals. In a side chamber, they discovered a collection of small clay vessels, some cracked, some worn smooth, each bearing the faint imprint of a hand or tool. Sierra examined them carefully, noting the variations in size and shape, the subtle differences in color and texture. She arranged them on a low shelf, placing the larger vessels at the back and the smaller ones in front, creating a visual rhythm that reflected the original use of the space. Merrick guided her with quiet suggestions, pointing out details that might otherwise be overlooked. A faint groove in the stone where water had once drained, a subtle curve in a wooden post indicating the placement of a shelf, the gentle incline of a floorboard suggesting the passage of heavy baskets. Sierra followed these cues, moving with increasing confidence, her hands and mind working in harmony with the hidden space. As the afternoon sun shifted, the light within the undertown changed, casting long, soft shadows and illuminating patterns in the dust and debris. Sierra paused to observe, taking in the subtle interplay of light and shadow, the gentle resonance of the bell, and the faint, almost imperceptible sound of the river beneath the dock. She realized that each moment was part of the rhythm, that patience and observation were as important as action in understanding and restoring the space. Hours stretched into the late afternoon. Sierra and Merrick moved methodically through the chamber, lifting, brushing, and arranging, creating a sense of order and harmony. The undertown responded subtly, shadows settling, dust motes drifting in soft patterns, and the faint resonance of the bell echoing through the corridors. The hidden passages seemed to recognize their care, adjusting to their presence with a gentle acknowledgement that was felt rather than heard. Sierra discovered a small, previously overlooked doorway leading to a lower passage. The boards were worn and uneven, and the air grew cooler and damper as she peered inside. Merrick placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "This is where the heart begins," she whispered. "Move slowly, with care. Listen before acting." Sierra stepped into the lower passage, feeling the subtle rhythm of the space beneath her feet. The walls were lined with stone and wood, and the scent of clay, herbs, and river water deepened. She traced her fingers along the surfaces, feeling the history embedded in each groove and curve. Small fragments of clay and wood lay scattered, and she lifted them carefully, arranging them in patterns that echoed the original order. Merrick followed closely, guiding her with gentle suggestions. "Notice the lines in the stone," she said. "They indicate weight, movement, and use. Follow them, and the space will reveal its secrets." Sierra moved deliberately, lifting clay fragments, arranging hooks, and brushing dust from the surfaces. Each action required attention, patience, and care. She felt a deep connection to the generations who had passed through the passages, their movements and rhythms embedded in the stone, wood, and dust. By late afternoon, the lower passage was transformed. Clay fragments were organized, hooks restored, and cloth bundles arranged with care. The space seemed to breathe around them, acknowledging their presence and effort. The brass bell, resting nearby, chimed faintly, a gentle echo of their careful work. Sierra paused, leaning against the cool stone wall, feeling the quiet pulse of the undertown. She understood now that the hidden passages were alive, responding to those who approached with patience, observation, and gentle attention. Each object, surface, and sound held meaning, and her careful actions had awakened a rhythm that had been dormant for decades. Merrick placed a hand on her shoulder. "You have learned much today," she said. "The undertown responds to care, attention, and patience. These are lessons that will guide you not only here, but in the world above." Sierra nodded, feeling the truth of her grandmother's words. She understood that the undertown was not merely a physical space, but a living rhythm, a world that required careful observation and gentle interaction to be fully understood. As the sun dipped lower, they began the slow journey back to the entrance. The passage seemed to settle around them, shadows shifting subtly, dust motes drifting in soft patterns, and the faint hum of the bell echoing through the corridors. Sierra felt a deep sense of accomplishment, knowing that their careful work had restored not only order, but a sense of rhythm and life to the hidden space. Emerging onto the dock, Sierra breathed deeply, inhaling the mist-laden air of the river. The town above had resumed its ordinary rhythm, but she noticed every detail: sunlight glinting on copper pots, the scent of spices drifting from stalls, the gentle sway of reeds in the current. She carried the lessons of the undertown with her, a slow, deliberate awareness that would guide her every movement. At home, her family greeted her quietly. The warmth of the hearth, the smell of bread, and the soft murmur of conversation reminded her that the ordinary world had its own rhythms. Sierra felt a quiet satisfaction, knowing that the undertown awaited her return, patient and deliberate, ready to share more of its secrets when approached with care. That evening, as lanterns glimmered along the river and the town settled into soft hums, Sierra lay in bed, thinking of the lower passage, the pale powder, and the worn boards. She felt the rhythm of the hidden passages beneath the dock, the gentle lesson of patience and observation, and the quiet anticipation of returning the next day to explore further. The undertown had begun to speak to her, softly and slowly, revealing its secrets to those willing to listen and act with care. Sierra understood now that memory, attention, and deliberate action could awaken spaces long forgotten. and that even the smallest gestures could bring a hidden world back to life. And so, as the river flowed quietly beneath the docks, as lanterns glimmered and the town breathed in gentle evening hums, Sira drifted into sleep, the pulse of the undertown echoing softly in her mind, a rhythm of patience, care, and quiet restoration that would guide her in the days to come. The following morning, a gentle mist lay across the river and the town of Grieve, softening rooftops and wooden piers, turning the familiar streets into a quiet, silvered world. Sira woke with the memory of yesterday's work still warm in her mind, the smooth grooves of the boards, the faint resonance of the brass bell, the soft hum of the undertown as it responded to her care. She dressed carefully, tying her braid low and securing her bundle of brushes, threads, and the bell. The air was cool and fragrant, carrying the faint scent of wet straw, river water, and herbs tucked in crates overnight. She moved toward the dock with deliberate steps, each one mindful, feeling the rhythm of the planks beneath her feet and the subtle vibration of the river through the pilings. Mist drifted lazily over the water, curling around the edges of the docks and hiding the boats in soft gray shapes. The town was nearly silent, save for the occasional creak of wood or distant call of a bird. Sira inhaled deeply, savoring the calm, letting her senses attune to the stillness around her. America waited at the threshold of the undertown, leaning lightly on her polished oak cane. Her gray eyes, sharp and steady, followed Sira's approach. Today, she said softly, "We complete what we have begun. The undertown has waited long enough for attention. Now, it will speak fully to those who have listened and acted with care." Sira knelt beside the narrow gap beneath the crate, brushing her hands across the boards to lift the faint dust and debris from the night. She dipped her brushes in oil and warm water, moving slowly, deliberately, as if any haste might disturb the rhythm of the hidden passages. The undertown welcomed them, the cool air carrying the scent of stone, clay, and river water. Each board, each groove, each small object seemed alive, waiting to be acknowledged. They entered the first chamber, the one that had been the focus of their work over the past days. The shelves were cleared, the clay fragments arranged, the hooks restored, and the cloth folded with careful precision. The brass bell from earlier days rested on a low shelf, chiming faintly as Sira brushed past. She felt the pulse of the space beneath her fingers, the rhythm of its slow, deliberate response. Merrick knelt beside her. Every object, every surface, every sound is part of a living rhythm, she said. The undertown remembers those who approach with patience. Today, you will understand more fully. Sira moved deeper into the chamber, tracing grooves in the boards and the curves of the walls with her hands. She lifted clay fragments, arranging them with deliberate care. Each object responded to her touch, not in movement but in the subtle acknowledgement of presence, as though the undertown recognized the care and attention she had given. The faint resonance of the brass bell echoed softly, harmonizing with the creaks and whispers of the boards. Hours passed in quiet rhythm. Sira worked meticulously, restoring small fragments, arranging hooks, and folding cloth. The space seemed to breathe around her, shadows shifting subtly, dust motes floating in the shafts of light that filtered through cracks above. Every stroke of the brush, every careful placement of an object, contributed to the harmony of the undertown. At midday, Merrick poured tea from her flask, the aroma of mint and dried herbs blending with the cool, damp air. They sipped quietly, listening to the subtle sounds around them, the faint creak of boards, the distant hum of the river beneath the dock, the soft chime of the bell. Sierra felt a deep connection to the space, sensing its rhythm and its memory in every movement. "Do you understand now?" Marek asked softly. "The undertown is more than stone and wood. It is rhythm, memory, and attention. It responds to those who listen and act with care." Sierra nodded. She realized fully that the hidden passages were alive, not in the sense of movement or sound, but in the way they held and remembered the presence of those who treated them with respect. Each object, surface, and subtle echo carried meaning, and her careful work had helped awaken the pulse of a space long forgotten. They moved into a lower passage, previously hidden, the boards worn and uneven beneath their hands. The air grew cooler, heavier with the scent of clay, herbs, and river water. Dust settled on surfaces that had not been touched in decades, and Sierra brushed it gently, revealing the worn lines of the boards, the subtle grooves in the stone, and the faint curves of old shelves. Merrick guided her with gentle instructions. "Notice how the walls curve, how the boards slope, how the space responds to touch. Follow these patterns, and the undertown will reveal its secrets." Sierra moved slowly, tracing grooves and lifting objects with care. Small clay fragments, worn hooks, and remnants of thread were organized meticulously. Each object seemed to carry a faint echo of the hands that had once handled it, and Sierra felt a deep connection to the generations before her. The pulse of the undertown flowed through her movements, quiet and deliberate, a rhythm that harmonized with her own breath and heartbeat. Afternoon light shifted through cracks above, illuminating dust motes and highlighting subtle details in the boards, shelves, and fragments. Sierra paused to observe, taking in the interplay of light and shadow, the gentle hum of the bell, and the soft resonance of the river beneath the dock. Each moment reinforced the lesson she had learned. Patience, careful observation, and deliberate action were essential to understanding and restoring the hidden passages. Hours stretched on as they worked together, methodically arranging, cleaning, and restoring. The undertown responded subtly, shadows settling, dust motes drifting in soft patterns, and the faint resonance of the bell echoing through the corridors. Sierra felt a profound satisfaction, knowing that her careful attention had helped awaken a space long dormant, bringing it back into a rhythm that honored its past and present. By late afternoon, the lower passage was restored to a state of gentle order. Clay fragments were arranged, hooks replaced, cloth bundles folded neatly. The space seemed to settle around them, acknowledging their presence and effort. The brass bell, resting nearby, chimed softly, a quiet confirmation of the careful work that had been done. Sierra leaned against a cool stone wall, breathing deeply, feeling the rhythm of the undertown in her movements and breath. She understood now that the hidden passages were living, in the sense that they responded to care, attention, and gentle interaction. Each object, surface, and subtle sound held meaning, and her careful actions had awakened a pulse that had been dormant for decades. Merrick placed a hand on her shoulder. "You have learned much," she said. "The Undertown responds to patience, observation, and care. These lessons will guide you not only here, but in the world above." Sierra nodded, feeling the truth of her grandmother's words. She understood that the hidden passages were more than physical spaces. They were rhythms and memories, alive in subtle ways that required deliberate attention to perceive. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, they began the slow journey back to the entrance. The passage seemed to settle around them, shadows shifting subtly, dust motes floating in gentle patterns, and the faint hum of the bell echoing softly. Sierra felt a deep sense of accomplishment, knowing that their careful work had restored not only order, but also a sense of rhythm and life to the hidden space. Emerging onto the dock, Sierra breathed deeply, inhaling the mist-laden air of the river. The town above was alive, bustling with merchants, boats, and townspeople. Yet she noticed every detail: sunlight glinting on copper pots, the scent of spices drifting from stalls, the gentle sway of reeds in the current. She carried the lessons of the Undertown with her, a slow, deliberate awareness that would guide her every movement. At home, her family greeted her quietly. The warmth of the hearth, the smell of bread, and the soft murmur of conversation reminded her that the ordinary world had its own rhythms, each requiring attention and care. Sierra felt a quiet satisfaction, knowing that the Undertown awaited her return, patient and deliberate, ready to share more of its secrets when approached with respect. That evening, as lanterns glimmered along the river and the town settled into soft evening hums, Sierra lay in bed, thinking of the passages, the pale powder, the worn boards, and the gentle pulse of the Undertown. She felt the rhythm of the hidden world beneath the dock, the lessons of patience, observation, and care, and the anticipation of returning the next day to explore further. The Undertown had begun to speak to her softly, revealing its secrets only to those willing to listen, act with care, and move with deliberate attention. Sierra understood now that memory, attention, and gentle restoration could awaken spaces long forgotten, and that even the smallest gestures could bring a hidden world back to life. As the river flowed quietly beneath the docks, lanterns glimmered along the streets, and the town of Grieve breathed in gentle evening hums, Sierra drifted into sleep, the pulse of the Undertown echoing softly in her mind. A rhythm of patience, care, and quiet restoration had been established, guiding her in the days to come and leaving her with a profound sense of calm and wonder. The hidden passages rested in peace, their memory preserved, their pulse renewed, and the young girl who had learned to listen and move with care became part of the quiet heartbeat of the Undertown, a rhythm that would endure long after the mist lifted and the town of Grieve returned fully to its ordinary day. Our third story begins with the first light of dawn spilling over the plateau of Aylmar, a stretch of rolling hills dotted with crumbling stone fences and low wind-bent pines. The air is thin and cool, carrying the scent of dry grass, crushed earth, and distant smoke from the hearths of scattered homesteads. Mist drifts along the hollows, lingering like a whispered secret. Somewhere far below, a narrow river winds its way through the valley, its surface glimmering faintly in the early light. Settle in and rest a while. Lyra, 11 years old, stood at the edge of a worn path that led down the plateau toward a long forgotten ridge. Her hands were tucked into the sleeves of her wool tunic, the ends frayed from months of wear, and her dark hair was tied with a narrow strip of cloth. She carried a small bundle of tools, a brass brush, a length of soft cord, a tiny knife for shaping wood. She had found them hidden beneath a loose floorboard in her father's workshop, wrapped carefully in cloth. The plateau was quiet except for the low wind that stirred the pines and the faint skitter of small animals among the rocks. Lyra's eyes followed the path downward, noting the uneven stones, the patches of dry grass, and the occasional wildflower that had taken root between the cracks. There was something in the silence that felt like waiting. Her grandfather, Eldrin, emerged from the doorway of their homestead. His tall figure stooped slightly with age, his white hair pulled back into a neat braid. He carried a long walking stick, polished dark with years of use, and wore a coat patched at the elbows with coarse wool. His eyes, a pale gray, held the patience and calm of one who had spent a lifetime listening before speaking. "You are early," Eldrin said, his voice soft, carrying easily over the thin morning air. "The plateau rewards those who arrive before the sun fully rises." Lyra nodded, tightening her grip on the bundle. "I thought I could see more of the ridge if I started before the wind grew stronger." Eldrin smiled faintly. "Very well. But remember, we are not here to conquer the land or rush through it. We are here to notice, to touch, and to understand. The ridge has patience. It will wait for us if we move carefully." Together they began the descent along the narrow path, Lyra moving slowly, her eyes scanning the ground for the faintest traces of the old route. The stones were worn and uneven, the grass brittle from the frost of early morning, and the air carried the faint, sharp scent of crushed pine needles. Each step required attention, a careful balance of foot and weight, so as not to disturb the small, hidden life that made the plateau its home. They paused beside a fallen stone wall, moss-covered and crumbling, where a small metal hook protruded from the stones. Lyra knelt to examine it, brushing away dust and tiny fragments of moss with her fingers. Eldrin crouched beside her, observing quietly, his hands resting on his walking stick. "This hook," he said softly, "was part of the ridge's market long before our village existed. People brought small wares up here before dawn, before the wind had risen to scatter their steps. They left traces, not for us to take, but for those who know how to see." Lyra's fingers lingered on the hook, feeling the cold metal and the faint roughness of weathered stone. She imagined hands long gone, balancing baskets of herbs, thread, and small pottery on the uneven path, their careful movements guided by necessity and patience. The ridge seemed alive with the echoes of these past travelers, whispering through the wind, through the moss, and through the stones beneath her touch. "Shall we continue?" Eldrin asked, his eyes following the path downward. Lyra nodded, rising slowly, She adjusted the bundle in her arms and stepped carefully along the path, her attention drawn to every detail: the curve of a stone, the way sunlight caught a droplet of morning dew, the soft rustle of grass beneath small creatures. Each movement was deliberate, measured, and attentive, the kind of care that Eldrin had taught her through years of watching and helping. They reached a narrow crevice in the ridge where two stones leaned together to form a small arch. Beneath it, the ground was damp, dark, and scattered with fragments of clay and wood. Lyra knelt, brushing the surface gently with her brass brush, lifting dust and loose stones, revealing the worn patterns of the floor beneath. "The ridge has memory," Eldrin said softly. "It remembers the steps of those who came before, the weight of their baskets, the rhythm of their hands. Approach carefully, and it will share what it knows." Lyra lifted fragments of clay, arranging them with care. Each piece had a story: the curve of a cup, the faint imprint of a hand, the subtle discoloration from repeated use. She stacked them gently, preserving their shape and integrity. The small brush moved slowly across the wood and stone, removing the dust of years without disturbing the surface, allowing the history to speak softly beneath her touch. Hours passed in deliberate rhythm. Lyra moved carefully, lifting, brushing, and arranging, while Eldrin guided her with quiet suggestions. "Notice how the stone curves here," he said. "The slope indicates the passage of weight. The indentations are traces of movement. Follow them, and the ridge will reveal its structure." Lyra nodded, observing closely. She felt a connection to the generations who had moved through these passages, their careful, deliberate steps embedded in the stone and earth. Each groove, each curve, each faint mark was a note in the rhythm of the ridge, and she moved with the pulse, attentive and respectful. The sun rose higher, casting long beams across the plateau, illuminating dust and fragments that had long lain hidden. Lyra paused, noticing the interplay of light and shadow, the faint hum of wind through the crevices, and the subtle, almost imperceptible resonance of the ridge itself. She understood that each moment was part of the rhythm, that observation and care were as essential as physical restoration. They discovered a small chamber beneath the ridge, partially collapsed, filled with remnants of the old market, fragments of cloth, small clay cups, twisted hooks, and bundles of herbs long dried. Lyra examined each item carefully, brushing dust away and arranging them in patterns that echoed their original use. The space seemed to respond subtly to her attention, shadows settling, dust motes drifting, and faint echoes resonating through the stone. Eldrin guided her through the chamber, pointing out details that might otherwise be overlooked: a groove in the floor where a basket had rested, the curve of a wall indicating the placement of a shelf, a faint imprint in clay suggesting the use of a small tool. Sira followed his guidance, moving slowly and deliberately, her hands attuned to the rhythm of the space, her mind absorbing the subtle lessons embedded in every surface. Afternoon approached, and the light shifted, deepening the shadows and highlighting the textures of stone, wood, and clay. Lyra continued her work, brushing, lifting, and arranging with careful attention. Each object she touched, each surface she observed, became part of her understanding of the ridge, its memory, and its pulse. They paused to rest, sharing a small meal of bread and dried fruit. The quiet companionship was comfortable. The gentle murmur of the wind, the distant river, and the faint echo of the ridge providing a soft background. Eldrin spoke little, allowing Lyra's attention to remain on the rhythm of the space, reinforcing the lesson that patience and observation were paramount. By late afternoon, they had restored much of the chamber, arranging the fragments of clay, the hooks, and the cloth bundles with meticulous care. The ridge seemed to settle around them, acknowledging their presence and effort. The faint resonance of the ridge, the soft hum of wind through crevices, and the subtle movement of dust motes reinforced the quiet satisfaction of their work. As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, Eldrin and Lyra prepared to return to the plateau above. They retraced their steps, careful not to disturb the fragments, the boards, or the subtle traces of the passage. The ridge seemed to respond, shadows shifting gently, dust settling, and the faint pulse of memory echoing through the stones. Emerging onto the plateau, Lyra breathed deeply, feeling the warmth of the sun on her face and the cool breeze across her skin. The town below moved in its ordinary rhythm, but she noticed every detail: the glint of sunlight on rooftops, the scent of herbs and wood smoke, the distant sound of river water. She carried the rhythm of the ridge with her, a deliberate awareness that would guide her every step. At home, her family greeted her quietly. The warmth of the hearth, the smell of bread, and the soft murmur of conversation reminded her that the world above had its own rhythm, separate but connected to the pulse of the ridge below. Lyra felt a deep satisfaction, knowing that the hidden passages of the plateau awaited her return, patient and deliberate, ready to share their quiet secrets. That night, as the plateau settled into the hush of evening, Lyra lay on her mat, thinking of the narrow crevices, the pale dust, the worn boards, and the subtle pulse of the ridge. She felt the rhythm of the hidden passages, the lessons of patience and observation, and the gentle anticipation of returning the next day to explore further. The ridge had begun to speak to her, softly and slowly, revealing secrets only to those willing to listen and act with care. Lyra understood now that memory, attention, and deliberate restoration could awaken spaces long forgotten, and that even the smallest gestures could bring a hidden world back to life. And so, with the soft murmur of the wind through the pines, the distant river glimmering in twilight, and the plateau breathing in quiet evening hums, Lyra drifted into sleep, the pulse of the ridge echoing softly in her mind, a rhythm of patience, care, and quiet restoration that would guide her in the days to come. The morning mist had lifted from the plateau of Aylmar, leaving the earth damp and glistening, the grass soft beneath Lyra's careful steps. Sunlight filtered through the wind-bent pines, casting long golden beams across the uneven stones and crumbling fences. The air smelled faintly of earth, crushed grass, and smoke from distant hearths. Lyra rose with the first light, her dark braids secured neatly, and gathered her small bundle of tools, the brass brush, a length of soft cord, a tiny knife for shaping wood, and the cracked bell she had found in the hidden passage. Each item she carried with care, aware of its purpose and the quiet rhythm it would bring to the ridge. Her grandfather, Eldrin, waited at the edge of the narrow path leading down to the lower crevice. His tall figure was steady, though bent slightly with age, and his eyes, pale gray and sharp, followed her movements as she approached. His polished oak cane tapped softly against the stone, a subtle rhythm that seemed to harmonize with the whispering wind. "You are punctual," Eldrin said, his voice low and calm. "The ridge measures our attention. Those who arrive before the sun fully rises are often rewarded with details the day hides from the hurried." Lyra nodded, adjusting the bundle in her arms. "I want to see more, Grandpa," she said. "I want to understand the ridge as fully as I can." Eldrin smiled faintly. "Then we shall move slowly. The ridge will tell us its secrets if we listen and act with care. Haste will only silence its whispers." Together, they descended the worn path, their steps deliberate. Each stone, each tuft of grass, each hidden crevice beneath the plateau seemed to hold memory. Subtle and patient, Lyra moved with her eyes scanning every detail, a curve in the stone, the way sunlight glinted off dew, the gentle sway of the long grass. Her hands brushed over rough surfaces, feeling texture, temperature, and shape. Each step was careful, each movement measured, a conversation with the land itself. They reached the narrow arch of the lower passage, where the boards and stones formed a small, hidden chamber. The air was cooler here, carrying the faint scent of clay, earth, and herbs long stored in forgotten baskets. Dust had settled thickly over the surfaces, and Lyra knelt to brush it away, revealing the grooves, indentations, and faint markings left by the hands of traders and travelers who had passed this way long ago. Eldrin crouched beside her, observing quietly. "The ridge is patient," he said. "It remembers the touch of hands long gone and responds to those who honor its rhythm." Lyra's fingers lingered on a worn groove in the stone floor. She imagined the hands that had pressed here before, traders balancing baskets, children carrying small bundles of thread, women holding clay cups. Each mark was a memory, subtle and persistent, waiting for someone to notice and respect it. She lifted a small fragment of clay, examining its curve and worn edges, then set it carefully on a nearby ledge. Hours passed in deliberate rhythm. Lyra brushed, lifted, and arranged, working methodically under Eldrin's quiet guidance. She restored hooks to their proper positions, folded cloth remnants, and organized clay fragments. Every movement was slow and attentive, every placement considered. The brass bell, resting on a low shelf, chimed faintly with subtle vibrations as she moved near it, a soft acknowledgement of her careful touch. Midway through the morning, they discovered a small side chamber, previously hidden beneath a pile of fallen stones. The space was narrow, lined with low shelves and containing fragments of clay, bundles of thread, and tiny remnants of wood. Lyra knelt, brushing away layers of dust, revealing the worn surfaces and faint markings that told the story of long past activity. Each item she uncovered carried a quiet narrative: the curve of a cup, the frayed edge of cloth, the smoothness of a wooden hook worn by countless hands. Merrick had taught patience, but here, Eldrin's guidance emphasized observation and careful restoration. "Notice the details," he said softly. "The way the floor slopes, the indentations in the stone, the gentle curves in the wood. Each feature guides your hands and your understanding of the space." Lyra worked slowly, aligning clay fragments, restoring hooks, and folding cloth bundles. Each object was placed deliberately, preserving its history while creating a subtle order within the chamber. The air was cool and filled with the faint scent of herbs, dust, and the earthiness of clay. Shafts of sunlight filtered through cracks above, illuminating the dust motes that floated lazily, catching and scattering the light like tiny stars suspended in motion. Time moved differently in the undertown. Hours passed unnoticed, measured only by the movement of light and the subtle changes in the shadows. Lyra became attuned to the pulse of the ridge, each stroke of her brush and careful placement of an object synchronizing with the quiet rhythm of the hidden passages. Eldrin watched silently, offering occasional guidance, pointing out subtle details that might otherwise be overlooked. "Do you feel it?" he asked softly. "The pulse of the ridge? It is slow and deliberate, but alive. It responds to those who move with care, with attention, and with respect." Lyra nodded. She could feel it now. The quiet heartbeat of the undertown, the memory embedded in every stone, every groove, every object. She understood that the ridge was more than stone and wood. It was a living rhythm, a history that responded to patience, observation, and careful interaction. By midday, they had worked through the side chamber and returned to the main passage. Lyra lifted a small bundle of herbs, brushing away dust and arranging it neatly on a low shelf. The aroma of dried thyme and mint mingled with the cool, earthy air, grounding her senses and connecting her to the generations who had stored, carried, and used these same herbs long ago. The faint resonance of the brass bell echoed softly, blending with the gentle creak of boards and the subtle shift of dust motes in sunlight. Eldrin guided her to a previously overlooked corner, where the boards had warped slightly and a low arch led to a narrow tunnel. "This is one of the heart passages," he said. "Few have entered here for decades. Move carefully. Let the ridge speak to you before you act." Lyra entered the passage, her movements slow and deliberate. The air was cooler, denser, carrying the faint scent of clay, wood, and river water. The boards creaked softly under her weight, the sound harmonizing with the gentle rhythm of the hidden space. She brushed away dust and loose fragments, revealing subtle grooves, faint curves, and the small imprints of hands long gone. Each detail guided her touch and understanding, teaching her patience and careful observation. Hours passed in quiet restoration. Lyra moved deliberately, lifting small clay fragments, arranging hooks, and folding cloth with precision. Each object, each surface, each subtle mark in the boards held meaning. The ridge responded to her attention, shadows settling, dust motes drifting, and the faint resonance of the bell echoing softly. Eldrin observed, offering guidance only when necessary, emphasizing observation, care, and deliberate action. By late afternoon, the passage had been restored to a state of gentle order. Clay fragments were arranged, hooks returned to their positions, cloth bundles folded carefully. The space seemed to settle around them, acknowledging their presence and effort. The pulse of the ridge, subtle and deliberate, resonated through the boards, the stones, and the objects they had restored. Lyra paused to rest, leaning against a cool stone wall, feeling the rhythm of the ridge in her movements and breath. She understood now that the hidden passages were alive, not in the way of movement or sound, but in the way they remembered and responded to those who approached with care. Each object, surface, and subtle echo held meaning, and her careful actions had awakened a pulse that had been dormant for decades. Eldrin placed a hand on her shoulder. "You have learned well," he said softly. "The ridge speaks to those who move slowly, who notice, who care. These lessons will guide you beyond these passages, into the world above." Lyra nodded. Feeling the depth of the lesson, she realized fully that the Undertown was a living rhythm, a memory, and a pulse that responded to deliberate, careful attention. Every stroke of the brush, every placement of an object, every quiet observation contributed to the awakening of a hidden world. As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, they retraced their steps toward the entrance of the Undertown. The passage seemed to settle around them, shadows shifting subtly, dust motes drifting, and the faint pulse of memory echoing through the stone. Lyra felt a deep sense of accomplishment, knowing that their careful work had restored not only order, but also the rhythm and life of the hidden passages. Emerging onto the plateau, Lyra breathed deeply, inhaling the crisp air and feeling the warmth of sunlight on her face. The town below had returned to its ordinary rhythm, but she noticed every detail: the glint of sunlight on rooftops, the scent of herbs and smoke, the gentle sway of long grasses in the wind. She carried the lessons of the ridge with her, a quiet awareness that would guide her every movement. At home, her family greeted her with gentle smiles. The warmth of the hearth, the smell of bread, and the quiet murmur of conversation reminded her that the ordinary world had its own rhythm, connected subtly to the pulse of the ridge. Lyra felt satisfaction and calm, knowing that the hidden passages awaited her return, patient and deliberate, ready to share their secrets with care. As evening fell, the plateau settled into soft quiet, the pines whispering in the wind, the river glimmering faintly below, and the ridge holding its memory alive. Lyra lay on her mat, the soft hum of the wind through the pines mingling with the quiet pulse of the ridge. She drifted into sleep, the rhythm of care, patience, and gentle restoration echoing softly in her mind, guiding her in the days to come. The morning arrived quietly on the plateau of Aylmar, the air thin and crisp, carrying the scent of dew-soaked grass and the faint tang of river water from the valley below. Lyra woke before the sun fully illuminated the world, her small hands clutching the bundle of brushes, cord, and the brass bell she had carried through the hidden passages. Each object felt like an extension of her curiosity, a tool for discovery, a companion for the quiet work that awaited her. The wind stirred gently through the pine trees, and with it came the faint, whispering sound of the ridge itself, soft, deliberate, as if urging her forward. Her grandfather, Eldrin, stood at the threshold of the narrow path, leaning lightly on his polished oak cane. His white hair was caught in the morning light, and his pale gray eyes observed her approach with quiet attention. "Today," he said softly, "we venture into the deepest part of the ridge. What we find there has not been touched for decades. We must move carefully, listen closely, and respect the rhythm of the space." Lyra nodded, adjusting the bundle across her chest and stepping carefully along the worn path. Each stone pressed beneath her feet told its own story. Each tuft of grass bent to the wind seemed to remind her to move slowly. She felt the subtle vibration of the earth beneath the boards and stones, a quiet pulse that mirrored the rhythm of her own breath. The ridge, she realized, was alive not in movement, but in memory. Every indentation, every groove, every curve an echo of those who had come before. As they descended toward the lower crevice, Lyra's eyes caught the glint of dew on a moss-covered stone. She knelt, brushing her fingers over the surface, noting the fine texture, the faint traces of wear, and the small indentation where a basket her foot had pressed centuries ago. Eldrin watched silently, offering guidance only when necessary, pointing out subtle lines in the stone or the way the boards had warped with time. They entered the narrow passage beneath the ridge, where the air was cooler and heavier, scented faintly with clay, earth, and the remnants of dried herbs. Dust had settled thickly, and Lyra carefully brushed it away with her soft, bristled brush, revealing worn grooves, faint curves, and the subtle imprints of hands long gone. She lifted small fragments of clay, examining their curves and edges, setting them aside on a clean patch of stone. Each fragment seemed to carry a memory, a whisper of the lives that had touched it, the rhythm of the ridge responding to her careful movements. Hours passed in quiet rhythm. Lyra moved deliberately, lifting, brushing, and arranging objects with precise care. The brass bell, resting nearby, chimed softly when she brushed near it, a gentle acknowledgement of her attentiveness. Eldrin observed, offering guidance only when necessary, emphasizing patience, observation, and deliberate action. Each small motion became part of the rhythm of the undertown, a conversation between past and present, between stone and hand, between memory and care. They reached a small chamber, hidden beneath a low archway, its walls lined with shelves that had long been empty except for scattered remnants, clay cups, twisted hooks, frayed cloth, and small bundles of herbs. Lyra knelt, brushing away layers of dust, revealing the worn surfaces beneath. Each object held its own story, the curve of a cup, the smooth edges of a hook, the faint smell of herbs pressed long ago. She arranged the fragments in patterns that reflected their original use, lifting each with reverence, placing them carefully, and noticing the subtle lines and curves of the surfaces beneath her hands. Eldrin crouched beside her, observing quietly. "Notice how the ridge has been shaped by time," he said softly. "The boards, the stones, the surfaces all tell of careful use, deliberate movement, and patient hands. You must follow the patterns and allow the ridge to teach you its story." Lyra nodded, moving slowly, attentive to every detail. She traced the curves of the shelves, lifted small clay fragments, and brushed the surfaces of the boards with care. Each object seemed to respond to her touch, settling into a gentle harmony, a rhythm that was felt more than heard. The ridge spoke in subtle ways, through shadows, texture, and the faint resonance of the brass bell. By midday, they had worked through much of the hidden chamber. The clay fragments were organized, hooks replaced, cloth bundles folded neatly, and the space began to feel as if it had returned, slowly, to its original rhythm. Lyra paused to rest, leaning against a cool stone wall, feeling the subtle pulse of the ridge beneath her hands and feet. She realized that the hidden passages were not merely spaces, but living memories, responding to care, attention, and deliberate restoration. Eldrin poured a small cup of tea from his flask, the aroma of dried herbs mingling with the cool, damp air. They sipped quietly, listening to the faint creaks of boards, the subtle hum of wind through the crevices, and the soft, almost imperceptible resonance of the ridge. Lyra felt a deep connection to the generations who had moved through these passages, their careful, deliberate steps embedded in the stone, wood, and dust. After their brief rest, Eldrin guided Lyra to a lower passage, previously hidden beneath a pile of fallen stones. The boards were uneven, and the air grew cooler and heavier, carrying the scent of clay, earth, and herbs. Lyra moved slowly, brushing away dust and debris, revealing subtle grooves, faint curves, and small indentations. Each surface held memory, each object held a story. She arranged clay fragments, restored hooks, and folded cloth bundles, working with care and attention. The pulse of the ridge beneath her hands seemed to respond, a quiet acknowledgement of her deliberate actions. The afternoon light shifted through cracks above, illuminating dust motes and highlighting textures of stone, wood, and clay. Lyra paused to observe, taking in the subtle interplay of light and shadow, the soft resonance of the bell, and the gentle rhythm of the ridge itself. Each movement, each careful gesture reinforced the lessons she had learned. Patience, observation, and deliberate restoration were essential to understanding and awakening the hidden passages. Hours passed, measured by light, movement, and breath. Lyra continued her work methodically, arranging fragments, restoring hooks, and folding cloth bundles. The undertown responded subtly, shadows settling, dust motes drifting, and the faint resonance of the bell echoing through the corridors. Each object, surface, and subtle sound held meaning, and her careful actions contributed to the awakening of a space long dormant. By late afternoon, the lower passage and hidden chamber had been restored to a state of gentle order. Clay fragments were aligned, hooks replaced, cloth bundles folded neatly, and the space seemed to settle around them, acknowledging their presence and effort. The pulse of the ridge resonated faintly through boards, stone, and objects, a quiet, deliberate rhythm of memory and care. Lyra paused, leaning against a cool wall, feeling the subtle heartbeat of the ridge beneath her hands and feet. She understood fully now that the passages were alive, not in the sense of motion or sound, but in the way they remembered and responded to those who approached with careful attention. Each object, each surface, each subtle echo carried significance, and her deliberate actions had awakened a hidden pulse, restoring rhythm to a space long forgotten. Eldrin placed a hand on her shoulder. "You have done well," he said softly. "The ridge responds to patience, care, and observation. These lessons extend beyond these passages, into the world above." Lyra nodded, feeling the quiet truth of his words. She realized that the undertown beneath the ridge was a living rhythm, a memory embedded in stone, wood, and dust, and that her careful attention had helped awaken it. Every deliberate brushstroke, every careful placement, every small gesture contributed to the revival of a hidden world. As the sun began to set, they began the slow ascent back to the plateau above. The passage seemed to settle around them, shadows shifting, dust motes drifting, and the faint pulse of memory echoing softly. Lyra felt a deep sense of accomplishment, knowing that their careful work had restored order, rhythm, and life to the hidden passages. Emerging onto the plateau, Lyra breathed deeply, inhaling the warm air and feeling the sun on her face. The town below moved in its ordinary rhythm, yet she noticed every detail: the shimmer of sunlight on rooftops, the scent of herbs and smoke from hearths, the subtle sway of grasses in the wind. She carried the lessons of the ridge with her, a deliberate awareness that would guide her every step. At home, her family greeted her quietly, the warmth of the hearth and the soft murmur of conversation reminding her that the ordinary world also carried its own rhythm. Lyra felt calm and satisfied, knowing that the hidden passages awaited her return, patient and deliberate, ready to reveal more of their quiet secrets. As evening fell, the plateau settled into a hush, the wind through the pines whispering softly, the river glimmering faintly below. Lyra lay on her mat, listening to the pulse of the ridge echoing in her mind. The rhythm of patience, attention, and gentle restoration guided her thoughts as she drifted into sleep. The quiet heartbeat of the ridge, a soft lullaby that would remain with her in the days to come. The morning dawned pale and soft over the plateau of Aylmar, the sun spilling faint gold across the wind-swept pines and dry grasses. Lyra rose before the light had fully settled over the valley, the quiet hum of the ridge already resonating in her mind. She moved deliberately, gathering her bundle of brushes, the brass bell, soft cord, and the small knife she used for shaping wood. Each item had become a companion, a tool for careful exploration, and a marker of the slow, deliberate rhythm she had learned to follow. Eldrin stood at the threshold of the narrow path that led to the hidden passages beneath the ridge, his white hair catching the early light, his oak cane tapping softly against the stones. His eyes, pale and steady, tracked Lyra's every movement. "Today," he said, his voice low and calm, "we will go further than before. The hidden passages await those who move with patience and care. Every step, every gesture, every touch is a conversation with the ridge." Lyra nodded, adjusting her bundle across her chest and stepping carefully down the worn path. Each stone, each tuft of grass, and each small crevice in the earth seemed to hold a story, pressing its rhythm into her awareness. The faint hum of the wind through the pines accompanied her, soft and deliberate, weaving between the folds of the plateau. The ridge, she felt, was alive in memory, a pulse of history embedded in stone, wood, and earth. They reached the narrow archway of the lower passage, where the boards and stones formed a hidden chamber. The air was cooler here, heavier with the faint scent of clay, earth, and dried herbs. Dust had settled thickly over the surfaces, but Lyra brushed it away carefully, revealing grooves, curves, and subtle indentations left by hands long gone. She lifted small fragments of clay, examining their edges and curves, placing them carefully to one side on a clean patch of stone. Each fragment seemed to carry a quiet memory, a soft echo of those who had moved through these passages before her. Eldrin crouched beside her, observing in silence. "The ridge remembers those who approach carefully," he said softly. "It responds to deliberate attention. Every mark, every object, every surface tells a story if you are patient enough to notice. Lyra's fingers lingered on a worn groove in the floor, imagining the hands that had pressed there before. Merchants balancing baskets of herbs, children carrying small bundles of thread, women holding clay cups. She felt a connection to the past, a rhythm that was slow and deliberate, yet profoundly alive beneath her hands. Hours passed as Lyra worked quietly, moving methodically through the chamber. She brushed dust from hooks and boards, arranged clay fragments in careful patterns, and folded the remnants of cloth. Every motion was slow and deliberate, each placement measured and attentive. The brass bell, resting nearby, chimed faintly when she brushed near it, a soft acknowledgement of her care and attention. Eldrin offered guidance only when necessary, pointing out subtle details, a curve in the boards, a groove in the stone, a slight bend in a shelf. Lyra followed these cues, moving with increasing confidence, her hands and mind fully attuned to the pulse of the ridge. Mid-morning brought them to a side passage previously hidden beneath a pile of fallen stones. The boards were uneven, the air cooler and heavier with the scent of clay, wood, and river water. Lyra moved carefully, brushing away dust and debris, revealing subtle grooves, faint curves, and small imprints of hands long gone. She arranged clay fragments, restored hooks, and folded cloth bundles, working slowly and attentively. The pulse of the ridge beneath her hands responded gently, a quiet acknowledgement of her careful actions. By midday, they had worked through the chamber and side passage. The clay fragments were aligned, hooks returned to their positions, and the cloth folded neatly. The space seemed to settle around them, acknowledging the care and attention that had been given. Light filtered through cracks above, illuminating dust motes and highlighting the textures of stone, wood, and clay. The faint resonance of the bell echoed softly, harmonizing with the quiet rhythm of the ridge and the subtle creaks of boards beneath their feet. Eldrin poured a small cup of tea from his flask, the aroma of mint and dried herbs mingling with the cool, damp air of the passage. They sipped quietly, listening to the faint creaks of boards, the subtle hum of wind through the crevices, and the soft, almost imperceptible resonance of the ridge itself. Lyra felt a profound connection to the generations who had moved through these passages, their careful, deliberate steps embedded in stone, wood, and dust. "Do you feel it?" Eldrin asked. "The pulse of the ridge? It is slow, deliberate, alive in memory. The passage responds to those who notice, who act with care." Lyra nodded, sensing the quiet rhythm that guided her movements. She understood now that the hidden passages were alive, not in the way of sound or movement, but in the way they remembered and responded to those who approached with patience and attention. Each object, surface, and subtle mark was part of the ridge's rhythm, and her deliberate actions contributed to its restoration. In the early afternoon, they discovered another chamber, partially collapsed, its shelves laden with remnants of long-forgotten trades. Bundles of cloth, clay cups, twisted hooks, and dried herbs. Lyra moved carefully, brushing dust away, revealing worn surfaces and subtle markings that spoke of decades of use. Each object was lifted, examined, and placed deliberately, respecting the integrity of the space and the story it carried. Eldrin observed silently, offering guidance only when necessary. Notice the lines in the stone, the curves of the wood, the indentations in the floor, he said. They indicate weight, movement, and use. Follow these lines, and the ridge will reveal its secrets. Lyra worked slowly, her hands brushing over clay fragments, hooks, and cloth bundles. Each item seemed to respond to her touch, settling into gentle harmony, a rhythm that was felt rather than heard. The brass bell, resting nearby, chimed faintly in acknowledgement. The passage, once quiet and still, now hummed softly with restored rhythm, the memory of past hands responding to her care. Hours passed in the quiet work of restoration. Lyra moved methodically, brushing, lifting, and arranging, creating a subtle order from fragments and dust. Shadows shifted with the movement of sunlight through cracks above. Dust motes drifted like tiny stars, and the faint resonance of the bell echoed softly through the hidden chambers. Each motion, each touch, was deliberate, part of a rhythm that connected past and present. By late afternoon, the chamber and side passages were restored to a state of gentle order. Clay fragments were aligned, hooks restored, cloth bundles folded neatly. The space seemed to settle around them, acknowledging their presence and the careful attention given. Lyra paused, leaning against a cool stone wall, feeling the pulse of the ridge beneath her hands and feet. She understood now that the passages were alive in memory, responding to those who approached with patience, observation, and care. Eldrin placed a hand on her shoulder. "You have done well," he said. "The ridge responds to those who move slowly, who notice, who care. These lessons extend beyond the passages, guiding your hands, mind, and heart in the world above." Lyra nodded, feeling the quiet truth of his words. She realized that the hidden passages were more than stone and wood. They were a living rhythm, a memory embedded in the ridge itself, restored through deliberate, attentive care. As the sun began its descent, they began the slow ascent back to the plateau above. The passage seemed to settle around them, shadows shifting, dust motes floating gently, and the faint pulse of memory echoing softly. Lyra felt satisfaction and calm, knowing that their careful work had revived not just order, but rhythm and life within the hidden passages. Emerging onto the plateau, Lyra breathed deeply, inhaling the warm air, the scent of earth and pine, and the faint smoke from hearths in distant homesteads. The town below moved in its ordinary rhythm, yet she noticed every detail: sunlight glinting on rooftops, the subtle sway of grasses in the wind, the distant shimmer of the river. She carried the lessons of the ridge with her, a quiet awareness that would guide her every movement. At home, her family greeted her quietly. The warmth of the hearth, the soft murmur of conversation, and the smell of bread reminded her that the world above had its own rhythm, connected subtly to the pulse of the ridge below. Lyra felt calm, satisfied, and ready to rest, knowing that the hidden passages awaited her return, patient and deliberate, ready to share more of their quiet secrets. That evening, as lanterns glimmered along the plateau and the wind whispered through the pines, Lyra lay on her mat, thinking of the passages, the pale dust, the worn boards, and the pulse of the ridge. She felt the rhythm of the hidden world beneath the plateau, the gentle lessons of patience, observation, and care, and the anticipation of returning the next day to continue exploring. The ridge had begun to speak softly, revealing secrets only to those willing to listen, act with care, and move with deliberate attention. Lyra understood that memory, careful observation, and gentle restoration could awaken spaces long forgotten, and that even the smallest gestures could bring a hidden world back to life. And so, with the soft hum of the wind through the pines, the distant glimmer of the river, and the plateau settling into quiet evening, Lyra drifted into sleep, the pulse of the ridge echoing gently in her mind, a rhythm of patience, care, and quiet restoration that would guide her in the days to come. The morning on the plateau of Elmar arrived in gentle, muted light, with a pale gold that touched the tips of the wind-bent pines and warmed the tops of the dry grasses. The air was cool and carried the faint scent of the river far below, mingled with earth and crushed pine needles. Lyra woke before dawn, her hands instinctively finding the bundle of tools she had carried for days: the brass brush, soft cord, knife for shaping wood, and the small cracked bell she had learned to cherish. Each object felt like an extension of herself, a quiet companion for the deliberate work of observing, restoring, and listening. Her grandfather, Eldrin, waited at the threshold of the narrow path leading toward the ridge's hidden passages. His pale gray eyes were calm and steady, his oak cane tapping softly against the stones, marking a rhythm that Lyra had learned to follow. Today, he said gently, we complete what we have begun: the passages, the chambers, the ridge itself. They are ready to reveal their final story, but only to those who move with care and patience. Lyra nodded, adjusting her bundle and stepping carefully along the worn stones. The path was uneven, lined with tufts of grass and small rocks, each detail etched into the memory of the plateau itself. She moved slowly, sensing the rhythm beneath her feet, the subtle vibration of earth and stone, the whisper of the wind threading between the pines. The ridge, she felt, was alive in its memory, and she had learned to move in harmony with its pulse. They descended toward the hidden archway, the air growing cooler and heavier with the faint scent of clay, earth, and herbs preserved in hidden chambers. Dust had settled overnight, and Lyra brushed it away gently, revealing the worn grooves, subtle curves, and faint indentations left by the hands of those who had traveled the passages long ago. She lifted small fragments of clay, examined them carefully, and set them aside, organizing them with the deliberate care she had practiced for days. Each piece seemed to carry a memory, a soft echo of the lives that had passed before her, and she felt the ridge respond quietly to her touch. Eldrin crouched beside her, observing silently. The ridge remembers all who approach with attention, he said. Every mark, every surface, every object holds a story. The deeper you listen, the more it will reveal. Lyra traced a worn groove in the stone floor, imagining the hands that had pressed there, traders carrying herbs and threads, children delivering messages, women balancing baskets of clay cups. Each mark was a faint pulse, a rhythm embedded in the floor, and she felt herself moving in harmony with it. Her fingers brushed gently over the surface, lifting dust and aligning small fragments of clay with deliberate care. Hours passed in quiet rhythm. Lyra worked methodically through the main chamber and side passages, restoring order to clay fragments, hooks, and bundles of cloth. Each placement was careful and attentive, every stroke of her brush deliberate. The brass bell resting nearby chimed faintly with a soft, clear resonance whenever she moved close, a subtle acknowledgement from the ridge itself. By late morning, they reached the farthest chamber they had yet explored, partially hidden beneath a fallen wall of stones. The air was cooler here, heavier, and smelled faintly of clay and river water. The floor was scattered with fragments of tools, dried herbs, and remnants of cloth. Lyra knelt carefully, brushing the dust and debris away, revealing worn grooves, faint curves, and subtle imprints. She lifted each object with reverence, placing it neatly and observing the faint, almost imperceptible traces left by countless hands over generations. Eldrin's voice was soft. Notice the lines, the curves, the subtle slopes. They are guides left by time, showing where weight rested, where hands moved. Follow them, and the ridge will teach you its story. Lyra followed his guidance, her movements slow, her attention full. She aligned clay fragments, restored hooks, and folded cloth bundles with precision. The space seemed to respond, shadows settling, dust motes drifting, and the faint resonance of the brass bell echoing gently through the chamber. The passage, once silent and dormant, now breathed in a rhythm of careful attention and deliberate restoration. As the afternoon sun filtered through the cracks above, illuminating dust and fragments, Lyra paused to observe. She traced the subtle textures of stone and wood, feeling the pulse of the ridge beneath her fingertips. Light and shadow danced across surfaces, highlighting curves and indentations, revealing the stories embedded in the stone. The faint hum of the ridge seemed to pulse in tandem with her breath and heartbeat, a quiet, deliberate rhythm that resonated through her mind and body. Hours continued in quiet work. Lyra brushed, lifted, and arranged, carefully restoring the hidden chambers. Clay fragments were aligned, hooks returned to their original positions, cloth bundles folded with meticulous care. Each motion was deliberate, each touch thoughtful, contributing to the slow, patient awakening of the space. The brass bell chimed faintly as if acknowledging the harmony restored by her attentive hands. Mid-afternoon brought them to a lower passage, narrower and more secluded than any they had explored. The boards beneath their feet were worn and uneven, and the air grew cooler, heavy with the scent of clay, wood, and river water. Lyra moved slowly, brushing dust away, revealing subtle grooves, faint curves, and small indentations. Each surface carried memory, each object held story. She arranged clay fragments in hooks, folded cloth, and moved through the passage with deliberate care. The pulse of the ridge seemed to respond, shadows settling and dust motes drifting in soft patterns, as if acknowledging her careful actions. Eldrin's guidance remained quiet and deliberate. Patience, he said. Observe before acting, notice before moving. The ridge will show its secrets to those who are ready to see. Lyra nodded, feeling the rhythm of the ridge in every movement. She traced grooves in the stone, aligned clay fragments, and restored hooks with precision. Each touch, each brush stroke, contributed to the harmony of the hidden passages. The faint resonance of the bell echoed softly through the chambers, harmonizing with the subtle creaks of the boards and the whisper of wind through the cracks above. By late afternoon, the lower passage and hidden chambers had been restored to a state of gentle order. Clay fragments were aligned, hooks replaced, cloth bundles folded neatly. The space seemed to settle around them, acknowledging their presence and careful attention. Shadows shifted gently, dust motes floated lazily, and the faint hum of the bell resonated softly through the ridge. Lyra paused, leaning against a cool stone wall, feeling the pulse of the ridge beneath her hands and feet. She understood fully now that the hidden passages were alive, not in the sense of movement or sound, but in the way they remembered and responded to care. Every object, surface, and subtle sound held meaning, and her deliberate actions had awakened a rhythm that had been dormant for decades. Eldrin placed a hand on her shoulder. "You have done well," he said softly. "The ridge responds to those who notice, who care, who move with patience. These lessons extend beyond these passages into every part of life above." Lyra nodded, feeling the quiet truth of his words. She realized fully that the undertown beneath the ridge was a living rhythm, a memory embedded in stone, wood, and dust. Every deliberate brushstroke, every careful placement, every attentive observation had contributed to its revival. The pulse of the ridge, subtle and deliberate, resonated in her mind and body, a quiet rhythm she would carry beyond these hidden chambers. As the sun began to lower toward the horizon, Eldrin and Lyra began their slow ascent back to the plateau above. The passages seemed to settle around them, shadows shifting, dust motes drifting, and the faint pulse of memory echoing softly. Lyra felt a deep sense of accomplishment and calm, knowing that their careful work had restored rhythm and life to the hidden passages, connecting past and present in quiet, deliberate harmony. Emerging onto the plateau, Lyra inhaled deeply, feeling the warmth of sunlight, the crisp air, and the faint scent of earth and pine. The town below moved in its ordinary rhythm, yet she noticed every detail: the shimmer of sunlight on rooftops, the scent of herbs and smoke from hearths, the gentle sway of grasses in the wind. She carried the lessons of the ridge with her, a quiet awareness that would guide her every movement and gesture. At home, her family greeted her quietly. The warmth of the hearth, the gentle murmur of conversation, and the faint aroma of bread reminded her that the world above had its own rhythm, connected subtly to the pulse of the ridge. Lyra felt calm and satisfied, knowing that the hidden passages awaited her return, patient and deliberate, ready to reveal further secrets only to those who approached with care. As evening deepened, the plateau settled into quiet hush. Lanterns glimmered faintly in the distance. The wind whispered through the pines, and the river below reflected the soft pink and gold of sunset. Lyra lay on her mat, the pulse of the ridge echoing gently in her mind. She thought of the worn boards, the grooves, the clay fragments, the hooks, and the bundles of cloth. She felt the rhythm of the hidden passages, the lessons of patience, attention, and careful restoration, and the anticipation of returning to explore further in the days to come. The ridge had begun to speak, softly and deliberately, revealing its stories to those willing to listen and act with care. Lyra understood now that memory, attention, and deliberate restoration could awaken spaces long forgotten, and that even the smallest, quiet gestures could bring a hidden world back to life. Night fell over the plateau. The pines whispered with the wind. The distant river glimmered faintly, and the ridge rested in patient stillness. Lyra's eyes closed, and she drifted into sleep, the pulse of the hidden passages echoing in her mind. A rhythm of patience, care, and quiet restoration that would remain with her forever.